Hello and welcome to Hidden Dusk, a place where the night grows quiet and the shadows begin to tell their stories. Before we begin, dim the lights, get comfortable and relax. And if you enjoy calm and eerie stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let the darkness guide you into tonight's story. After a lot of thought, I've finally decided to share an experience I had. This isn't a story about seeing ghosts or hearing voices, but it's about something I truly felt. To give a bit of background, my grandmother passed away from breast cancer when I was 9. We were extremely close, and her death was hard on me. Even now, at 19, I think about her constantly and miss her deeply. This past summer, I went in for a routine checkup. I'd never had any issues before, so when the doctor finished the exam and looked concerned, I was shocked. During the breast examination, he mentioned he might have found a lump. For anyone who doesn't know, a lump can sometimes indicate breast cancer or another abnormality. As my mom and I left the doctor's office, I felt like my world had flipped upside down. I was in a daze, barely able to process anything. The doctor told us to arrange an ultrasound at the hospital to confirm or rule out any issues. Thankfully, my mom managed to get me an appointment the very next day. The exam went smoothly, and at the end, the nurse told us everything looked fine. There was no lump. I can't describe the relief I felt in that moment. It was as if a massive weight had been lifted. It was on the drive home that the experience happened. I was staring out the window as my mom drove, still overwhelmed with relief, when something caught my eye. We passed a white Oldsmobile from the early 90s, and as I glanced at the license plate, my heart skipped a beat. The plate read, Peggy 94. My grandmother's name was Peggy, and while she was alive, she drove a white Oldsmobile just like the one we'd passed. Then the number clicked. 1994 was the year my brother was born, on my grandma's birthday. For a moment, I was speechless. Finally, I turned to my mom and asked if she'd seen it too. She looked at me, confused, so I explained what I'd seen. By the time I glanced back out the window, the car had already driven off, so I couldn't show her. A few days later, as I retold the story, my mom confessed that she'd teared up when I told her about the license plate. I truly felt my grandma's presence with me that day. I believe she sent me a sign to remind me that she's still watching over me, even after all these years. I've shared my stories before about strange experiences in my childhood home in Lisle, Illinois, particularly the ghost farmer incidents. But there's one event that stuck with me more than anything else. It may not have been paranormal, but recalling it still gives me chills. Some background. Between our house and our next-door neighbors was a path that connected our driveway to a crosswalk. This path continued past a few more houses and led to the local elementary and junior high schools. Throughout the year, it was common to see kids, joggers, and even elderly folks walking along this path. The summer before my senior year of high school, I was 17 and spending a lot of time outside. I had tried my hand at gardening, though I quickly discovered I didn't have much of a green thumb. I'd often be out there planting or watering, or sometimes just sitting in the yard, when I began noticing a boy around my age who walked down the school path at nearly the same time each day. He seemed to be coming from the cul-de-sac across the street, which had 3 ranch-style homes. I'd say it was always around 1 p.m. The first time I saw him, I was in the front yard watering. He barely caught my attention, but I did take note of what he was wearing. He had on a black fedora-like hat, a black sweatshirt, black pants, and black shoes. He walked with his head down, not in a rush but not lingering either. I just assumed he was a local kid using the school path. For about a week, he passed by at the same time every day. By then, I was a bit curious. So one afternoon, I decided to talk to him. As a single, 17-year-old girl, I was probably more curious than cautious. I waited in the backyard near a flower bed, ready to say hi. Like clockwork, he came by around 1 p.m. I called out, "Hey!" He stopped and turned to look at me. When he looked up, my stomach dropped. His skin was incredibly pale, even paler than mine. His lips were a faint pink, and his eyes. There was something deeply unsettling about them. They looked blank, vacant, almost dead. I know it sounds like a cliché, but the sight froze me in place. He didn't say a word. just turned back around and continued walking. The mix of fear and embarrassment sent me back inside. I couldn't bring myself to go outside around 1 p.m. anymore. My dad noticed my sudden disinterest in gardening and asked why I'd given it up. I told him I'd had an awkward encounter with a guy on the path. Being the protective dad he was, he wanted to know who it was. I mentioned that he might be from one of the cul-de-sac houses across the street. My dad just said, "Huh," and thought maybe someone new had moved in. Then he told me that one of the houses there was vacant. It had belonged to a family with a teenage son. According to my dad, the parents had come home one night to find that their son had hung himself in the garage. After that, they moved away, and the house had been empty ever since. After that conversation, I stayed indoors. I saw the boy a few more times, always from a distance while peeking through the kitchen window. He wore the same black clothes every time. Once my senior year started, I got busy and stopped thinking about it. Fast forward to when I was 20. I was back in town helping my parents pack up our house. While driving through the old neighborhood one evening, I stopped at a four-way intersection near the junior high. It was getting dark, but there was still enough light to see. I checked both ways, no cars, so I started driving through the intersection. Out of habit, I glanced in my rearview mirror. There he was. Same black clothes, same hat, head down, walking across the intersection. I nearly drove off the road. Logically, I know it could have just been a regular teenage boy, maybe even going through a goth phase. But every time I remember that look on his face, I start to wonder. I'm 24 now, and I still think about it. Our old house is gone. The neighbors have moved on. But I can't help but wonder if that kid is still there. When I was 7, my mother, my brother, and I lived in a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet town in west-central Illinois. I'd been aware of the paranormal for a while. Our previous home had been a former abortion center in the 1800s, so strange happenings didn't feel new to me. The summer after my birthday, my grandmother bought my younger half-sister and me matching glow-in-the-dark Muppet shirts. They were too big, so we used them as nightshirts. I loved mine and wore it constantly. But one fall night, after the leaves had fallen and the world outside seemed barren, I became scarred by that shirt for life. I'd fallen asleep in my usual spot on the bottom bunk of my bunk bed, with my head near the window. I remember waking up mentally, realizing that Bluey, my stuffed rabbit, had fallen off the bed. Losing him was a big deal. I was really attached to him. I still hadn't opened my eyes because I had a strong sense that someone was watching me. Through my closed eyelids, I could see a bright green glow, the same color as my Muppet shirt. I figured it was just my shirt, but something felt off, and I wanted to be sure. I pulled the covers over my head and opened my eyes. I hadn't looked at my shirt yet, but the light was definitely coming from outside the blanket. I looked down and, to my shock, saw that I wasn't wearing my Muppet shirt at all, just a plain white tee. Confused, I took the shirt off without removing the covers and checked it from all sides. Still just plain white. I put it back on, sat up, and pulled the blanket down to see clearly. At the end corner of my bed sat a young boy, maybe around 7 or 8 years old, with pale hair and dark eyes. Strangely, he looked a lot like me. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. He had this smug, almost cool expression, while I stared at him with a mix of horror and disbelief. I knew right away he wasn't human. To my shock, he was wearing my Muppet shirt. The pattern was glowing on him, and seeing it on his ghostly body made it seem eerie and sinister. I tried to scream for my mom, but my throat felt tight, almost like I was paralyzed or mute. It was like that feeling you get before crying but never actually letting it out. After what felt like an eternity, he began to crawl toward me, his hands pressing into the bed, leaving little indentations as he moved. He sat on his knees right in front of me, our faces just inches apart. He looked at me for a moment, then bared his teeth in a smile. His teeth were mostly normal except where his canines should have been. There were fangs. Not vampire fangs, but more like those of a big dog, sharp and slightly curved. I was still trying to make sense of it when, suddenly, he vanished. No fading away or transition, he was just gone, like he'd never been there. I still couldn't speak or scream, and I stayed frozen, not daring to move. Then, A few minutes after he disappeared, the Muppets pattern materialized on my shirt, right where it belonged. It was as if it had slowly reappeared out of nowhere. I was too terrified to move or even reach for Bluey. I couldn't even go to my mom, too afraid of what else might be lurking in my room. A few weeks later, my great-grandfather Alan passed away. Since then, I've seen the boy 4 times, each one before a major loss in my life. Each time he appears, he still looks like a child, as if he's never aged. Before my boyfriend's car accident, I saw him in the mirror in my bedroom. This time he looked sad, almost as if he wanted to say something, but he disappeared before either of us could. I don't know if he's good or evil, he just seems there. I'm glad I haven't seen him recently, but I still sense him sometimes. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I'm not sure what to make of him, but I had to share. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It was just 3 days ago, on a Saturday morning around 8 a.m., when I decided to try astral projection. Everyone has their own way of doing it, but my method is to keep drifting back to sleep, relaxing my body to a point where I can't move. Once I reached that immobile state, I thought about leaving my body, and then it happened. I was floating above my bed, looking down at myself, completely out cold. I couldn't believe it had actually worked. I drifted through my wall and soared into the sky. Being out of my body felt different. The air on my face was somehow fresher, and the warmth of the sun was even more intense. After some joy riding outside, I felt a disturbance, almost like something was going on with my body back at home. I thought about my room, and instantly, I was back there, but I freaked out when I saw my cousin there, chewing gum and tossing the wrappers at me, laughing. He then walked into the living room. Moments later, my older brother came by, holding his new red and black hat, ready to show it to our parents. I felt myself getting pulled back to my body, like I was magnetized to it. I tried to resist, but I couldn't break free. Then I snapped back into my body. I jumped up and went to my cousin, saying, "Why were you throwing wrappers at me?" He looked at me, surprised, and asked, "How did you know I did that?" I told him, and he just laughed. Then I went to my brother and asked, "You're going to wear a red and black cap, right?" He looked at me, confused, and said, "Yeah, why?" Then pulled it from behind him. At that moment, I realized I'd actually achieved astral projection. I'd seen everything that happened even though my body had been asleep. But that night, strange things began happening. Around 9:38 p.m., while watching TV, I heard a screeching sound in my head. It would start, stop, then start again. Suddenly, a chill crept over the left side of my head. I knew something unusual was nearby. I switched on the pantry light, which lit up part of the kitchen and the front room. Then I saw it. A human-shaped figure, pitch black like a shadow, standing there. It had a strange pattern on the sides of its head, like a silver thunderbolt running horizontally. My heart pounded as it moved quickly toward me, and I ran straight into my room, hiding next to my sleeping dog. When my brother and cousin got home around 12:40 a.m., I told them what I saw, but they didn't believe me. Not long after, we all heard faint whistling coming from our room. Ever since I astral projected, I've noticed strange things happening. Yesterday, I felt someone following me up the stairs, right behind me. Even my dog stares at the bed sometimes, like he's watching something invisible. I wonder if this is a side effect of astral projecting. But despite it all, I still love doing it. Even now, I get those chills on the left side of my face, and when I do, I always seem to see something. My brother thinks this means I have heightened awareness, that I can see things others can't. The shadow figure with the black cloak still pays me visits now and then. It never does anything, just stares at me and leaves. I thought everyone could sense things like this, but apparently, I'm the only one in my family who sees it. My parents insist that the old 2-story house where I spent my first 6 years was haunted. I was young at the time, so I don't remember much, other than feeling scared at night and refusing to go anywhere near the basement. Our house was on a historic street in a small town, right next to a house where Abraham Lincoln had once stayed. We lived on the ground floor and owned the basement, while the neighbors rented the top floor and the attic. Little things happened here and there. Lamps would swing on their own, and our cats would paw at the basement door every night at midnight, staring at it like something was on the other side. Sometimes my parents would come home to find themselves locked out. The only latch locked was one they never used because they didn't have the key. Once, while joking about the house being haunted, my mom and dad witnessed a kitchen shelf collapse out of nowhere. But there are two incidents that stand out, ones I still tell people about today. The first incident happened one night when my uncle was in town. That night he, my dad, and my mom were cleaning out the basement. Our basement was unfinished, with one main room and two side rooms attached by archways. It was in the last, darkest room, farthest from the basement steps, that they found it. A stone bust of a young woman, with the word expectations engraved at the base. They couldn't understand why such a beautifully sculpted bust was hidden in the basement's darkest corner instead of displayed above a fireplace. Curious, they decided to bring it upstairs. Along the way, my mom joked that it might be haunted because it looked so old. My uncle, laughing, dared it aloud. "Okay, then, haunt me." They all laughed it off, but something about the bust felt strange. They placed it on a table in the entrance hallway and dusted it off. I remember my mom saying it didn't feel right, like it didn't belong in the open. That night, my uncle was sleeping on the pull-out sofa in the living room when he awoke to a loud thud. Startled, he sat up to see that the large painting hanging on the wall above his head had fallen, landing just inches away from him. He was convinced it had something to do with the dare he'd made to the bust. The next day, Expectations was returned to the basement, where it apparently belonged. The second incident happened when I was around 4 or 5. My mom had a friend, Molly, who often visited us with her 9-year-old daughter, Mina. My mom and Molly would chat while Mina and I played. Molly claimed to be somewhat of a medium, though my mom never took it too seriously. One night, Molly and Mina were staying over, sleeping on the pull-out sofa in the living room. That night, Molly couldn't sleep because she kept hearing the nagging voice of an old woman. The voice repeated, "I told you I didn't like that color," over and over, mixed with random mumbled phrases. Molly tried to ignore it, thinking it was probably noise from the neighbors upstairs. But then she realized something strange. She couldn't hear any other voices, which meant it couldn't be the neighbors. And the voice was too clear, too close. To make things worse, Mina stirred and said she could hear it too. The next morning, Molly told my mom about the old woman's voice. My mom thought it was odd, since she'd never heard the neighbors' conversations through the ceiling before. A month later, we had some electricians in to work on the wiring above the old drop ceiling in our kitchen. My mom walked in to check on the work and noticed one of the ceiling tiles was removed, exposing the wall above. To her shock, she saw that the wall was painted a light pink, a color she recognized as shrimp, since she'd painted the kitchen cabinets the same color about a year earlier. But she had never painted above the ceiling. That's when it hit her. This must have been what the old lady had been complaining about. "I told you I didn't like that color." The kitchen had been painted that color years before, and my mom had unknowingly chosen the same color again, clearly displeasing someone. We moved out of the house when I was 6, but as I've gotten older and more interested in the paranormal, I'd love to visit again. I wonder if the current residents have experienced anything similar. It had been a long night. I was visiting my sister Chelsea in Illinois, and we'd spent the entire day babysitting her younger half-siblings. Finally, after we got them to bed, or so we thought, Chelsea suggested we try the Ouija board. I was nervous. I'd never used one before and had always thought of them as tools that could be dangerous if misused. Once I calmed myself down, I agreed, but only after taking some precautions. I gathered 6 light-colored candles, mostly white, with a few light blue ones, prayed over Chelsea, the room, myself, and blessed everything there was to bless, even the board and pointer. I also read a few Bible passages, including the Lord's Prayer and Psalm 23. We arranged the 6 candles in a circle around us on the floor and set 2 Bibles open in front of us. Just as we were about to start, there was a loud knock on the door that made us both jump. It was Chelsea's little brother. "Can I come in? I want to see. Let me in." "I'm telling Mom," he called out. We yelled at him to go away, and he finally left. Once things quieted down, we began. We started by greeting the angels around us and expelling all demons, something that usually works when I use dowsing rods. I had no idea it wouldn't be enough this time. We asked to speak to a specific angel, and within a minute the pointer started moving, just a little at first, centering itself on the starting point. We began by asking questions that only one of us would know. "Do you mind if we ask a few questions to prove you're real?" I asked. The planchette moved so quickly that Chelsea's fingers nearly slipped off as it shot to yes. "Okay, what was my first dog's name?" Chelsea asked. It spelled out, Goofus. "Oh my gosh, that's close. His name was Doofus." Then I asked, "You know phone numbers, right?" It replied, "Yes. Could you tell me Chelsea's mom's phone number?" The planchette spelled out some numbers which we wrote down. They weren't exact, but close. When Chelsea started lifting her hand off the planchette, she looked at me skeptically. "You're moving this." "I swear I'm not. I'm just as surprised as you are." I insisted. "Quit lying. I've done the Ouija board before with my friend, and it's never worked this fast. We usually wait an hour, and even then, it moves slowly. You must be pushing it." We ended the session there. Downstairs, we shared our findings with Chelsea's mom and compared the phone numbers. Once again, they were close but not exact. Her mom started using the microwave, but it suddenly stopped working. Just before our session, it had been fine, and by the next morning, it was working perfectly again. That night was just the beginning. The next night, we decided to try again. By then, I had convinced Chelsea to be more open-minded, and we followed the same procedure. This time, we asked the same spirit some more questions. I asked, "Do you have any advice for me?" The planchette moved quickly, spelling out, Hodjucal 987. Then I asked, "Do you have any advice for Chelsea?" It spelled, "Have two muh fuss Robbie yells I will wjxiyej." It was strange, but I could tell each phrase was intentional, with the planchette pausing slightly between words. We eventually realized that we were speaking to two different spirits. One introduced itself as Yixley Zaffer, and the other as Gabriel Okikurix. At midnight, we ended the session and took our findings to Chelsea's mom. Upstairs, we'd had all the lights off except for our candles, and only one room separated us from the stairs. The stairs led directly to the kitchen, where no lights were supposed to be on. When Chelsea's mom came out of one of the kids' rooms, we tried to switch on the kitchen light. But nothing happened, the power was out. Looking through the kitchen window, we saw the neighbors' lights next door fully on, porch lights and house lights alike. On the opposite side, however, every house was completely dark. It was as if there was a line separating the houses with power from those without. For the next 2 hours, all the lights on our side remained off. When they finally came back on, the weather was perfectly clear. Though there had been a storm the day before, that day and the following were both calm and sunny. The next day passed as usual, but we felt compelled to try again. I've been a cradle Catholic and, to be honest, kind of clueless most of the time, so bear with me. This happened almost a year ago, but I'll try to be as honest and specific as I can. I never really believed in things like Ouija boards or ghost hunting. I always saw it as fake stuff on TV. But I had a friend who used the Ouija board a lot and would tell me these wild stories about how it actually worked. I didn't believe her, so we decided we'd try it together. I knew my religion looked down on it, but I figured it was just a game, right? We cracked open a window and sat down in her cousin's room, where there was a computer a few feet away and a TV at the other end of the room. We turned off the lights, since we were using a cardboard glow-in-the-dark board, and introduced ourselves. We connected with a young boy who said he died in the 1600s or 1700s. He somehow knew our names and ages and even talked to us about the sports we played. When we asked him what his favorite thing was, the computer suddenly turned on and opened iTunes. We guessed that meant music, but it totally freaked us out. When we asked him to please turn the computer off, he did. We were spooked, so we decided to take a break and told him we'd be back in half an hour. But we didn't make it back for 2 hours. When we returned, the spirit seemed angry, especially at my friend. The TV started turning on and off by itself, and we quickly decided it was best not to mess with it anymore. After that, things got weird even during sleepovers at my house. My bedroom light would randomly turn on and off, despite changing the light bulbs and checking the circuits. In the hallway outside my room, I have sliding closet doors, and it bothers me when they're left open, so I always make sure they're shut. One day, I left my room to grab a snack, and every closet door was wide open. My family rarely goes into that hallway, so it made no sense. At my friend's house, we'd hear constant creaks, footsteps up and down the stairs, and even door handles turning. At my house, I'd hear someone whispering my name or muttering. One day, I noticed a corner of my room where I usually sit was much colder than the rest of the room. I felt ridiculous, but I stood in the middle of the room and asked, "If you're here, touch my hand." Almost instantly, my hand went freezing cold. I quickly decided I wouldn't be doing that again. Eventually, I'd had enough. One night, the lights were out again, so I took my camera, turned off the flash, and snapped 4 pictures. I loaded them onto my laptop, and in the 4th photo, I saw what looked like a pair of green eyes in the corner. My friend, who was with me, started crying, and we both ran out of the room. I was laughing hysterically, but only because I laugh when I'm really scared. The spirit had told us his name, but I've heard that saying a spirit's name gives it strength, so I won't repeat it here. I went to confession, and when I told the priest, he practically flipped out, telling me to burn the board. But it wasn't mine, and I'd also heard that burning it could make things worse. So I prayed a lot. I threw holy water around the house and slept with my rosary in hand. I've come to believe that Ouija boards and other forms of spirit communication are real and can be dangerous. Thankfully, I haven't had any strange experiences since. But I still wonder, am I going crazy? Or could this actually have been a spirit? Maybe even a demon? I really don't know. My family and I live in an apartment building, but each family has its own front and back doors, and everyone mostly keeps to themselves. We've been in this neighborhood since 1999, though we only moved into this particular apartment 3 years ago. Our previous apartment was right across the yard. It was strange there too, but nowhere near as bad as this one. Before we moved in, I remember hearing that a man had died in this apartment about a year earlier. At the time, I was expecting another baby, and with a growing family and limited finances, we needed the extra space. So, despite my reservations, we had to make the move. Almost immediately, problems began. Since moving in, my health has deteriorated. I was healthy before, but for the past 3 years, I've been sick constantly. I'm in and out of emergency rooms, but no one can find anything seriously wrong. I've had countless tests, but only minor issues show up. Last year, I even suffered a miscarriage, and I strongly feel that whatever presence is here didn't want my child to survive. It's as if these entities don't want us or anyone living here. I've seen several spirits in the apartment, all of them seeming Native American in appearance. There's a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, who usually just watches us without causing harm. Then there's a very menacing woman with long black hair and a ghostly white face who appears in the mirror in our downstairs half-bathroom. Upstairs, there's a very dark presence of unknown gender that feels especially evil. It often harasses me in the bathroom and hallway and sometimes walks around my bedroom, staying near the walls. There's also a shadowy figure that crosses the hall to the bathroom but never comes back out. I get the feeling they think we're trespassing on their land, and they can't find peace. My husband, who's from India, once slept in a different room to avoid disturbing me with his snoring. The next morning, he told me he'd had a vivid dream in which he was surrounded by Native American spirits who spoke to him with a sense of kinship. They were showing him around the neighborhood, telling him the land belonged to them and that they wanted it back. One of the most frightening incidents happened in late 2006, probably October or November. I was in the upstairs bathroom when I saw a spirit in my older daughter's room across the hall. I tried to ignore it, but later, when I was back in my bedroom reading, that same spirit came at me. It felt like it jumped onto my head and then pushed down into my stomach. I suddenly had the worst abdominal pain I'd ever felt, worse than any labor pain I've been through. At the same time, I felt dizzy, like something was trying to take over my mind. I fought back the only way I knew how, through prayer. I prayed harder than I ever had in my life, fighting for my sanity and my life. After that night, I hardly left the house. I became a recluse, and every time doctors prescribed medication, it would make me violently ill. But how could I even begin to explain all this to them? Then there's the issue of poisonous spiders that mysteriously appear in our bedrooms. And the illnesses, doctors can't seem to diagnose them. At the top of the stairs, I constantly get a vivid image of myself falling down and lying dead at the bottom. I hear ghostly voices, but they're never directed at me. They seem to be talking among themselves. At night, they all gather in the dark living room. If I come downstairs then, it feels like something tries to scare me into hurrying away. I dread going downstairs at night, though it's tolerable during the day. When I'm in the kitchen at night, I can sense something watching me. One evening, I was downstairs cooking and saw a small boy run past me from the living room and disappear by the back door. I thought it was my son, but he wasn't in the kitchen. We often hear the sound of slippers shuffling across the kitchen floor, and sometimes I smell cigarette smoke, even though none of our neighbors smoke. Occasionally, there's a pleasant scent, but not very often. I wish I could move out, but we just don't have the money to do so. My health is still poor, and I'm still running back and forth to doctors with no answers. I've considered having the apartment investigated, but I don't know if my neighbors have experienced anything similar. I'd really like to find out. When we first moved into the house I currently live in, my friend had to leave immediately afterward for work. I'd never lived in a detached home before, especially one so far from other people. This was the first house built on our block in a new subdivision, and with nothing but woods and wetlands behind us, it felt isolated. It was November, cold in the southern suburbs of Chicago, and I knew I'd be alone for a while. Our nearest neighbors were strangers and some distance away. So off my housemate went, leaving me in the silence of a brand new home. The first night, I stayed up as late as possible, even leaving the upstairs bathroom light on to ease my nerves. Early the next morning, I woke up to strange noises coming from above my bedroom, in the crawl space. I couldn't imagine what could be making those unsettling sounds up there, but I tried to stay calm. I climbed up, turned on the light, and peeked around, half expecting to find a small family of animals. Later that day, I called my friend and mentioned the noises. She listened, but I could tell she didn't want to worry me further. That evening, I stayed up late again, feeling exhausted. Some new furniture had been delivered, so I'd kept busy setting up the family room downstairs. Satisfied with how it looked, I finally went to bed, pulling a thick comforter over me and turning off all the lights. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a faint noise coming from below. It seemed to be coming from either the utility room, which has a door to the backyard, or the family room directly beneath my bedroom. In my mind, I pictured someone slipping in through that lower door and making their way through the family room, heading toward the main level. I froze, terrified. I was in a house with no nearby neighbors. It was winter, and I was completely alone. The sounds went on forever, then stopped only to start up again. I lay there, perfectly still, trying not to let my imagination run wild. Eventually, the noises faded, and I drifted off. The next morning, just before daybreak, the noises above my bedroom started again. Frustrated, I put on my robe and coat and marched outside. Standing in the middle of the driveway, I looked up at the eastern side of the roof. Crows, about a dozen of them, were pecking, cawing, and carrying on, totally ignoring me as they went about their crow business. I felt some relief at finally figuring out what had been making the noise. But that night, the mysterious sounds from below continued, making sleep difficult. As I finally dozed off, I was startled awake by what sounded like slow, steady footsteps coming up the stairs. I was terrified, but I resolved to investigate, even if I didn't want to. Then my logical side kicked in. Footsteps on the stairs? Wait, our stairs were carpeted. How was I hearing footsteps? I listened carefully. The footsteps never got closer to my room. Still scared, I decided to investigate. Turning on every light as I went, I made my way to the hallway and down to the living room. Peering over the railing, I looked into the family room. No ghosts, no intruders. I checked the lower-level bathroom and then made my way to the utility room. I switched on the light. Nothing. No one was there. Just then, the furnace kicked on, and I heard the footsteps again. Right there in the room with me. The utility room had a concrete floor, not wood, so it shouldn't sound like footsteps. I grabbed a chair from the family room, stood on it, and looked up at the furnace ducts. And there it was, a large piece of wood left by one of the carpenters. Whenever the furnace turned on, the expanding ducts would make the wood shift, creating a sound eerily similar to footsteps on a wooden floor. It gave me a few sleepless nights and a good scare. But hey, you gotta love carpenters. I've always been a skeptic. I believe that you believe what happened to you, but I need to experience things myself to truly be convinced. Growing up in an old farmhouse, one of the oldest in town, there were always creaks in the floors and stairs, doors closing by themselves and lights flickering. We just shrugged it off as the house settling. Fast forward 10 years, and I meet my now husband, who shared stories of strange, ghostly experiences he'd had throughout his life. I always believed him to a degree, but it was hard to accept fully without having my own experiences. Some of his stories seemed so far-fetched that the only thing that convinced me was how much he believed them. 2 months after we got married, we were staying with his parents, and I got a job at an antique store in town. The shop was set up in a house at least 120 years old. A grand, beautiful old home that must have once belonged to someone important or wealthy. It was the typical grand home with a foyer, parlor, dining room, and kitchen on the main floor and 5 large bedrooms upstairs. The house had a formal staircase in the foyer, right across from the front door, which had bells to signal anyone entering or leaving. Upstairs, there was a narrow hallway with a small banister and a back stairway that led down to the kitchen. The back door was never used by customers, only by me to come and go, so it was always deadbolted. I worked alone all day, rarely seeing the owner as she had another shop across town. The days were quiet, giving me plenty of time to read or nap, waking only when the bells chimed for customers. On this particular day, it was around 2 or 3 p.m., and only a few customers had come in. At one point, there was a rush of about 4 people all at once. I helped them find what they needed, rang them up, and they left. Knowing I wouldn't likely see anyone else, I called my husband, who was home since he had the day off. Just as we started talking, I heard the hall floor creak upstairs, followed by 2 women's voices discussing the Victrola near the top of the stairs. I told my husband I'd call him back since I somehow missed seeing a few customers come in. I like to keep an eye on everyone, as small items had a way of disappearing. I hurried up the front staircase, expecting to find the customers there. But there was no one. I checked the 2 bedrooms at the front of the house, empty. I made my way down the hall, looking into each room and closet, calling out, "Hello!" No response. Thinking they might have already gone downstairs through the back stairwell, I started down it toward the kitchen. Just a few steps down, I felt a cool breeze. It was gentle but gave me goosebumps. I tried to dismiss it as a draft, though I knew the air conditioners upstairs couldn't have caused it. I circled back through the parlor off the foyer, checking each room along the way, but the entire house was empty. They couldn't have left through the front door, as the bells would have chimed. Suddenly, I felt every hair on my neck stand up. Whether it was fear or something paranormal, I bolted to the phone and called my husband. I told him what had happened, practically yelling at him to come sit with me for the rest of the day. Luckily, he was only 6 blocks away and got there fast. When he arrived, he smirked and said, "I told you spirits and ghosts are real." From that moment on, I was a believer. When I shared the story with my boss, the owner, she told me little things like that happened all the time. She often heard voices or found things moved, and once, the old-fashioned cash register had dinged open by itself. After the antique shop closed, the house became a lawyer's office, and now it's a private home. I haven't spoken to anyone who lives there now, but I wonder if they've experienced anything unusual. Since that experience, I've had a few more encounters that I'll share another time. It may not be the most thrilling story, but it was my first real paranormal experience, and I just wanted to share it. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, Let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. This story was told to me by my fiancé, a serious man I've known for 15 years. He isn't one to make things up for attention, so when he shared these strange experiences with me, I knew he was being genuine. When he was in his late 20s or early 30s, he's now in his late 60s, he worked part-time at a gas station. One foggy morning, while he was outside taking readings on the pumps, this was before the computer age, he heard a metallic sound coming from up the road, something like a tin can rolling. As it came into view, he saw that it was actually a metal pie plate rolling down the road on its side. To his surprise, as it reached the station's driveway, it turned in and rolled up to the front door before flopping flat on the ground. He found it strange that the plate hadn't just kept rolling past the station. Instead, it had turned in like it knew where it was going. He brushed it off, finished recording the pump readings, and went back inside to enter the numbers, temporarily forgetting about the pie plate. After a moment, he glanced back out the door at the plate, and to his surprise, it started wobbling. Then, it jumped back up on its side, rolled out of the driveway, and continued down the road. The fog was beginning to lift, so he stepped outside to watch it roll away. He saw it turn onto a dirt road that led to an abandoned house nearby, a house that some people said was haunted. My fiancé couldn't shake the feeling that there was something odd about it all. He wondered if the plate had fallen off a passing vehicle, but he hadn't heard any cars go by, and there was no breeze that could have set it in motion. It reminded him of an old children's game where kids would roll pans or cans down the street with a stick. Was it possible this was the spirit of a child, rolling the plate down the road as if heading home? What do you think? He shared another story from his past with me, this one from when he'd moved to Indiana and was working at an appliance store. At the time, he was recently divorced, and his boss had made him a place to stay in a small room at the back of the store. One night, after a late dinner, he returned to the store and opened the back door. He immediately heard the sound of someone sweeping the floor in the front showroom, fast and furious. Startled, he called out his boss's name, but there was no reply. The sweeping continued. The odd part was that the showroom floor had just been carpeted with indoor-outdoor carpeting that day, so there was no reason for anyone to be sweeping like they would when it was vinyl flooring. Curious, he grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made his way toward the showroom. Just as he reached it, the sweeping stopped. He looked around but saw no one. He shrugged it off and returned to his room. A short time later, from the storage room next to his, he heard loud noises, as if someone were slamming boxed appliances against the wall. Bam! 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 The wall closest to his head shook with each thud. Yet by the time he got up to check, the noise had stopped. He couldn't find any explanation, so he went back to bed. As he began to doze off, he suddenly felt a presence in the room, as if someone had just entered and was standing there, watching him. The feeling wasn't friendly, and it lingered for a few minutes before fading away. After that, the rest of the night was quiet, and he didn't experience any other disturbances there again. The next day, he checked the storage room to see if any of the boxes had been moved, but nothing was out of place. Even the dust on the boxes was undisturbed, despite the loud noises he'd heard the night before. I can't believe he managed to stay in that room and actually get to sleep after all that. I guess it's a guy thing because I don't think I could have stayed there another night. My friends listen to my stories and say, every time, Sean, it's always something new with you. They don't understand that these things are very real to me, even if they can't see into my mind to know what I believe and feel. I live in Dixon, Illinois, in a smaller-sized house that's pretty nice overall. A few things needed fixing, but nothing major. The garage is attached with enough space for a car, and beyond that, there's a wall of plywood about 10 to 20 feet high. Above it, there's a large loft that runs over part of the house. I've stored some boxes up there, and the furnace is also in this area. The loft is open and hollow, crisscrossed with 2x4s in a bare framework. At first, it seemed like a cool, useful space, but in the second year after moving in, around 2007, I started noticing strange things. It began one summer night. I was up late, sitting at my computer. My desk is situated at the farthest point back in the open area beneath the loft. I had music on, chatting with friends, just enjoying a quiet evening. Suddenly, I heard light footsteps directly above me in the loft. As I sat there, wondering what it could be, there was a loud thud, as if someone had stomped down hard. I turned off the music, told everyone to hold on, and sat listening, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for another sound. And then it came, another thud, even louder than the first. It startled me so badly I jumped out of my chair. I felt a strong urge to go outside and check, so I found myself heading to the garage's side door, almost as if something was leading me there. As soon as I opened the door and stepped inside the garage, I flicked on the light, only for the bulb to immediately blow out, plunging me back into darkness. That should have been my cue to leave, but I was too curious. I went back inside, grabbed a flashlight, and returned to the garage. The air, which had been thick and humid when I first entered, now felt cooler and almost clearer. Not exactly cold, but less oppressive. I hoped whatever was up there wouldn't try to scare me, because I don't have the strongest heart for these things. A patch of wooden stairs, more like a ladder, went up the plywood wall, leading to the loft. I climbed up, flashlight aimed at the farthest point in the space. Nothing. I thought about heading back down, but the curiosity got the better of me. Then, a powerful odor filled the air, like a dead animal that had been left in the sun. It was unbearable, yet it seemed to get worse the closer I got to the back of the loft. The smell wasn't coming from the furnace, or I'd have noticed it right away when I first entered. As I took another step forward, I remember thinking how strange it was, but then things went blank. The next thing I knew, I felt like I was disconnected from reality, almost as if I'd blacked out. But it wasn't an ordinary blackout. It was like an intense, unnerving series of images flashing through my mind, scenes I can't even bring myself to talk about. They were so disturbing that I've had nightmares about them ever since. I felt like I was trapped, like nothing could snap me out of it. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was over, like a light switch being turned off. I came to, standing on my feet, my flashlight lying on the boards by my right foot. It was pointed toward the same area where I'd first heard the footsteps above my desk. I was shaken by what had just happened, but I picked up the flashlight and went straight to bed. Since that night, I haven't felt the physical sensations again, but those terrible images still haunt my dreams. I believe that spirit might have passed through me, and maybe it was so dark that it sent my mind into a downward spiral. Ordinary creaks don't scare me. This is an old house, but when I hear that same heavy thud from the loft, I feel that same intense fear all over again. Oddly enough, it never happens inside the main part of the house, only in the garage. When summer ended, the activity seemed to stop. But with another summer approaching, I can't help but worry it'll start again. Now, every time I go into the garage, even just to get to my car, I'm wary of that dark space above. It's an open area, so you can see all the way to the back of the loft as soon as you step in, but even during the day, that spot remains as black as night. I'm open to hearing what others think about this. My feelings about it are scattered, as you might have guessed. But if you ask me to elaborate on what I saw that night, all I can say is, if you were in my shoes, you wouldn't want to talk about it either. Snapshots of butterflies, that's all I can bear to say. My story begins in 1983, the year I was born in Des Plaines, Illinois. My parents and older brother had been living in a two-flat, but with a new baby on the way, they needed more space. House hunting was tough for them. They were on a tight budget and kept getting outbid. When they pulled up to a house just off Wolf Road Circle, it seemed too good to be true. It was a brick ranch with wood floors and plenty of space for our young family. There were schools and parks within walking distance, and my parents thought they'd never have a chance to place a winning bid. To their surprise, they learned the house had been on the market for 7 years, with previous residents leaving soon after moving in. My parents were thrilled and bought the house immediately. At first, everything seemed normal, and any small noises were just dismissed as the house settling. On the day of my christening, my parents invited everyone over to see the new house. We'd only moved in a month or two earlier, so it was the first time the family was seeing it. As soon as my aunt stepped inside, before even saying hello, she looked at my mom and said, "I won't go in your basement, and I won't go in your attic. My mom thought it was strange but brushed it off. While we lived in that house, odd things began happening. The kitchen was always about 20 degrees colder than the rest of the house, even on the hottest days. We'd hear footsteps in the hallway, echoing on the wood floors. One day, my godmother and mom were hanging out, watching me. They heard footsteps coming down the hallway, and at only 1 year old, I seemed to hear them too. As soon as the sounds reached the doorway, I began screaming and crying hysterically. They were so spooked they picked me up and ran out of the house, not returning until my dad got home from work. In the basement, we had storm windows with shutters that locked from the inside. Despite no wind coming through the window wells, the shutters would randomly bang at all hours. It wasn't just the sounds. Each member of my family was injured while we lived in the house. My brother, who was around 8 or 9 at the time, was playing on the living room floor when my mom heard him scream. She rushed in to find the fireplace mantle on top of him. He swore it had flown off the wall. It was a heavy piece of wood, and somehow it ended up 15 feet away from the fireplace. Another time, my dad was hanging up artwork in the hallway when his hammer suddenly flew backward, hitting him above the eye. He ended up needing stitches and still has 2 scars from where the sharp end hit him. My mom, too, was once pushed off the deck by an unseen force, breaking her wrist in the fall. I was the only one to actually see the ghost, though it remains a hazy memory. I was about 3 when my dad asked me to grab him a pop from the fridge. I remember little details like the socks he was wearing and my perspective walking down the hall. I reached the fridge, grabbed a pop, and turned around to head back. As I did, I screamed, and that's where my memory ends. My parents found me lying on the kitchen floor, but when they woke me, I couldn't remember what had happened. I'm 25 now and have tried to recall that moment, but I still can't. I've thought about going to a hypnotist to bring the memory back, but the thought scares me. As time went on, my parents got to know the neighbors, who eventually asked about our experiences with the house. They admitted they'd always known something wasn't right about it. The house had been vacant for years, and every family that moved in seemed to leave quickly. They explained that an older couple had lived there previously. The husband, a salesman, traveled often, and his wife, Pearl, had some kind of medical condition that kept her confined to a wheelchair. During one of his trips, Pearl passed away in the kitchen, and no one found her until her husband returned a week or 2 later. Although he moved out, he kept paying for the house to be maintained, with the heat and air conditioning left on for the 7 years it stood empty. Around that time, my mom went to see a psychic with some friends. During her reading, after the psychic talked about the usual life and family topics, she said, "I know that's not why you're here. You want to know who's in your house." My mom was shocked, but the psychic offered some advice. She told my mom to go home and tell Pearl that she was welcome to stay, as long as she left us alone. If she intended to cause trouble, she would have to leave. My mom followed her advice, had the house blessed, and after that, things quieted down. We stayed there for another 2 years before moving out. Now, I live about 40 minutes away, but whenever I pass that house, I still wonder if Pearl is there. I've always had a fascination with the paranormal. Even as a kid, I found reading ghost stories way more fun than playing with Barbies. I'm 26 now, but when I met my friend's ghost, I was only 16. My best friend, Michael, always claimed his house was haunted, but I was a bit of a ghost tracker back then and remained skeptical. Every year, his parents would go on a big snowmobiling trip to Wisconsin a couple of times each winter, and this would be the first time he and his sister, Casey, wouldn't have a babysitter. Their parents were usually a little too paranoid about leaving teens alone in the house. So, like responsible teenagers, Michael and Casey immediately planned to break every rule in the book and invited me over to join the fun. Michael's parents didn't like me much back then, but thankfully, that changed over time. With the house to ourselves, we went all out, making a mess cooking, watching movies, and blasting music. Casey and I eventually got tired of movies and decided dancing to music was more fun. So we sifted through our combined CD collections and landed on Marilyn Manson's Smells Like Children. Any Manson fans know the album starts with the hands of small children, which is just about as creepy as it gets. So we're trying to get the CD set up, with Michael bouncing around the room, but the CD player just wouldn't cooperate. 6 other CDs had played fine, but this one wouldn't work. Frustrated, I asked Michael to grab my soda from the kitchen. I had 2 cans on the table, one mostly full and another with just a few drops that I was using as an ashtray. One of the reasons his parents weren't exactly my biggest fans. As Casey and I kept struggling with the CD player, we heard sounds coming from the kitchen. I ignored it, used to Michael's random antics. Then, all at once, the CD finally came on, blasting out of nowhere, making Casey and me jump. Just then, we heard Michael's whimpering getting louder. We peeked around the corner into the kitchen to find Michael standing still, whimpering with his arm outstretched, pointing at the table. Casey and I looked at each other and walked over. "What?" I asked. He just kept whimpering. "What?" we both shouted. Michael slowly looked at me, his eyes wide with fear, still pointing. Finally, I realized he was pointing at the soda cans on the table, one of which was moving by itself. As we watched, the nearly full can started to inch its way around the other can, heading toward the edge of the table, picking up speed as it went. Just before it reached the edge, Michael, still in shock, grabbed it and put it back next to the other can. But it started moving again, making a direct path toward the edge. At that point, we were laughing and crying hysterically, not sure what to think. I remember grabbing Casey by her ponytail, half prepared to drag her out into the 3 feet of snow if things got worse. Luckily, nothing else happened that night, but it was just the start of 9 months of paranormal craziness in Michael's house. In the time that followed, I saw both white and black shadows in the house, one of which was an elderly woman who had owned the home before them. She'd passed away in the bathtub. I saw and heard dogs and cats they didn't own, and even spotted a cat sitting in their window. We heard footsteps, banging sounds, and whispering that you could follow down the basement stairs to the laundry room. Their computer would turn itself on whenever you approached it. Convenient, right? But the TV would switch channels in a creepy pattern. 66696669. One of the strangest things was the appearance of purple and yellow orbs in the laundry room. From what I've read, orbs visible to the naked eye are pretty rare. I've seen pillows leap from the couch to the floor, and the rocking chair in the living room liked to rock when someone sat there alone. Michael doesn't live with his parents anymore, but when we visit, the ghosts still make their presence known. They've definitely become a lasting part of his family's home. First, let me tell you a bit about my uncle. He drank a lot and could be overbearing at times, but as I remember him, he was outrageously funny, kind-hearted, and treated me and my siblings very well. Out of all his family, only my mother welcomed him into her home. His other siblings wouldn't allow him to stay with them. When my uncle passed, we had the repast at my aunt's house. Everyone gathered to eat, drink, and share memories of him. As the stories went on, pictures started falling, literally flying, off the walls. We were all stunned into silence, just staring at the frames now lying on the floor. Some of these pictures had been on her walls for as long as I could remember, and there they were, suddenly scattered across the floor. Then, we heard my twin cousin screaming, "Let me out!" He had gone to the basement to fetch something for my aunt. The basement door locked from the outside, and somehow the latch had moved into place, locking him in. We quickly released the latch and let him out, and he told us that just as he reached the door to come back upstairs, he heard the lock click. He couldn't open it. My only guess was that my uncle's spirit might have been upset, maybe unhappy with his siblings talking about him so much. After that, we stopped mentioning him. Not long after that, I had a recurring dream involving a cat. I have a strong fear of cats and dogs, so this dream was particularly disturbing. In it, I'd be walking through an empty building when a cat would jump onto my back. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it off. It clung to me, rubbing its face against mine, and I'd scream and shout, begging it to get off, but it wouldn't budge. Out of sheer panic, I'd wake up. This dream happened 3 nights in a row, each time more unsettling than the last. Finally, I told my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother about it. They all gave me the same advice. They believed the cat represented someone in my life who secretly resented me, and the dream was a warning. They urged me to be more careful about who I allowed into my life. I took their advice to heart and became more selective about the people I kept around. After that, the dream never returned. My best friend, who was like the sister I never had a strange dream of her own. We'd known each other since first grade and were incredibly close. She dreamed about her father, who had passed away. Before he died, he'd been diabetic, blind, and confined to a wheelchair. In her dream, though, he walked across the street, entered her home and said, "I came to see about you, Cookie." She dreamed this 3 times and called me to tell me about it. I didn't know what to make of it, and half-jokingly suggested maybe he was coming to take her with him to the other side. She said, "If it's my time, then so be it." 3 months later, she passed away from an unexpected illness. I miss her dearly, and sometimes I think about that dream and the words her father said to her. It's June, around 3 in the morning. The house is pitch black, and I'm ripped out of a deep sleep by a scream. This wasn't your average scream. It wasn't the "oh no, I've accidentally stabbed myself with a kitchen knife" kind of yell, nor was it the "good Lord, that was an alarming bathroom experience" scream. No, this was fear, raw, real fear. The "I just saw a freaking ghost" kind of fear. I bolted downstairs, mind blank with worry, and found Connor standing in the dining room, all the lights on, wailing. I grabbed him, asking what was wrong, checking him for blood, automatically doing a quick count of limbs and fingers. He was perfectly fine, just pale as a sheet. I asked him what happened. "I saw a ghost." Now, let me tell you, my kids know my unyielding stance on the paranormal. To me, ghosts rank about as high as noodling or NASCAR, deep down in the redneck gothic nonsense category. I don't buy into psychics, Bigfoot, the Bermuda Triangle, no money down refinancing schemes, and definitely not ghosts. It's not that I don't enjoy a good ghost story. I do. But I see it all as a bucket of self-delusion and a one-way ticket to Bonkerville. That said, I can spin a scary yarn. I've turned entire packs of Cub Scouts into wild-eyed believers, made them beg me to stop with ghost stories. Parents have pulled me aside to suggest maybe I try telling some lighthearted jokes instead. I can lay into a spooky tale with the best of them. And I've even met men of rock-solid character, people who would stare down danger without flinching, who swore they'd seen ghosts. But despite these first-hand tales from men of steel, I just couldn't bring myself to believe. Yet, I'll admit, I'm closer to believing now than I've ever been. If I squint just right, I can almost make out the outline of something on the other side of belief, like the opposite shore of a foggy lake. And it's not because of Connor's scare that night. It's because of our dog, Ty. Connor didn't want to talk about what happened that night. He crawled into bed between me and my spouse, fitfully falling asleep. The next day, he told me he'd looked out his bedroom door and seen a face peeking around the corner, only for it to quickly pull back out of sight. He screamed. I brushed it off, explaining it was probably just part of a dream mixed with nighttime sounds, and told him not to worry. He seemed to accept it, or so I thought. Then, months later, actually just yesterday, he brought it up again out of nowhere. We were driving back from downtown, just the two of us, when he told me a different version of what happened. He said he'd woken up because Ty, our dog, was whining. Sitting up, he saw Ty standing next to the bed, stock still, staring out the door. Then Connor looked up and saw a figure. Someone in nice clothes with white hair pulled back, peeking into his room. He said the figure looked amused, and then Ty took a step back. Connor explained that it took him a long time to scream, that he had to force it out. And when he finally did, he screamed for a long time before I got there. Of course, his sister never woke up. Now, a side note about Ty. He's basically our family's emotional support dog. When Connor gets hurt, Ty is all over him, tail wagging like mad, licking and nudging as if to say, "It's all right. You'll be okay. Look, I'm licking you. Everything's fine. Lick, lick, lick." But when I rushed downstairs that night to deal with the screaming, found Connor too scared to move, there was one detail I forgot until yesterday. Ty wasn't his usual self. He was standing in the dining room, tail dragging, with his furry but pressed up against the window, as far away from the hallway bathroom as he could get. Completely still, looking past me, over my shoulder, like he was waiting for something. Maybe Connor just had a vivid nightmare. Maybe a moth flew into his room and startled him. But Ty? This dog does nothing but wag his tail, lick people, and trot around like he's trying to plan our next walk. He never stands still. Ever. Even when he's told to stay, he's twitching, sweeping the floor with his tail, grinning, drooling. But that night, stone still, pressed up against the wall, eyes fixed on the bathroom. Now I don't know what to believe. I've always felt that something was around me, though I couldn't see it. There was just a sense of presence, a feeling that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I never wanted to see or feel anything unusual, but somehow I always did. I'll share a few of the experiences that have stuck with me. When I was young, I went through a rebellious phase. My mother would ground me, and I'd get into trouble all over again as soon as I could. One night, after a long argument, I was in my room, fuming. I'd gotten myself in trouble, but I was angry at her anyway. I was sitting there when I heard my name being called. I ignored it, thinking I'd make her wait a bit. Then I heard my name again, a little louder this time. Still, I didn't move. By the third time, the voice sounded even sharper, and I figured I'd better go see what she wanted. I walked slowly into her room and called her name, but she didn't answer. She was sound asleep, snoring as loud as ever. Confused, I called her name again, waking her up. She sat up and asked me what I wanted. I told her she'd called me, so I came to see what she needed. She looked at me and said she hadn't called my name. I was so scared I ran back to my room, threw the covers over my head, and forced myself to sleep. Another time, I was lying on my mom's couch, my back to the kitchen and my face turned toward the cushions. I saw someone out of the corner of my eye, coming from her bedroom. Thinking it was her, I pretended to be asleep, as we weren't exactly getting along that day. I felt the presence walk over and stand above me, watching me. I stayed perfectly still, waiting for it to go back the way it came. The next morning, I asked my mom if she'd come into the living room to check on me. She looked surprised and told me she hadn't left her bedroom. Once again, I was left scared and confused. Whenever things like this happened, I'd call my grandmother, who always had a way of explaining things to me. She'd say it was probably my aunt looking over me, keeping an eye on me. Years later, when my daughter was very sick in the hospital, I was so upset I could barely function. I couldn't sleep, eat, or drink. I sensed that she might not make it, and I wasn't ready to face the reality of losing her. I was sitting alone, needing to talk to someone, when suddenly, a young man entered the waiting room and sat beside me. He was dressed all in white and looked at me with a comforting smile. He asked me what was wrong, and I started telling him everything, about my daughter in the ICU, about how overwhelmed I felt. I can't even tell you how, but I ended up falling asleep. The next morning, the hospital staff woke me and told me my daughter was nearing the end and that I should see her for the last time. I asked them about the young man who had come in the night before and put me at ease. The staff looked confused and told me there was no one on duty that night who fit that description. I asked again, but they insisted they didn't know who he could have been. After my daughter's passing, I sometimes heard the familiar sound of her walker in our living room. I would pray she wouldn't come into my room, and sure enough, I'd hear her come down the hallway and stop just outside my door. Then the sound of her walker would start again in the living room. She never came inside my room, and somehow, I knew that meant she was at peace. That small sign helped me find some comfort and cope with the loss of losing her. Hello. I've had many paranormal experiences throughout my life, and some close friends, including my husband, believe I might have some psychic ability. I'll start with my most recent events and work my way back. Earlier this week, I dreamed of my grandfather, who passed away in 2004. In the dream, he was holding my newborn son, even though I'm still pregnant with him. In the dream, I knew my grandfather was a spirit. The very next day, my grandmother, his ex-wife, had a severe stroke and is currently in the hospital. I have a feeling his visit was a way to warn me of what was coming and to reassure me that he'll be watching over his great-grandson when he arrives. I've always been fascinated by the supernatural and have read and learned a lot about it over the years. The house where my husband and I live now is haunted. He's lived here longer than I have, and he's told me stories about light bulbs blowing out right after he replaced them, and the unmistakable feeling of a dark shadow moving behind him. It had been a while since he'd experienced anything, but on my second day here, things started happening. That second day, I had no idea of the strange things he'd experienced. I was feeling tired and decided to take a nap in our bedroom. Our bed is right next to the doorway, so you can't see who's entering the room until they're almost inside. As I lay there, drifting off, I heard a car door slam in our driveway. I thought it was odd since we weren't expecting anyone. A few moments later, I heard our side door open and footsteps moving around the kitchen. My initial thought was that it was a burglar. I lay frozen, afraid to move or make a sound, listening to the footsteps stop and start. When it went silent, I finally worked up the courage to grab a heavy object and peek into the kitchen. No one was there, and if someone had left, I would have heard the door close again, but I heard nothing. Shaken, I went back to bed and tried reading a prenatal book to calm myself. Then, I heard the side door open again and footsteps enter. They stopped right at our bedroom doorway, but when I looked, no one was there. My cat jumped down from the bed and ran into the hallway, staring intently into the bathroom across from our room. Terrified, I called my husband at work, and he just laughed and said, "I was wondering when you'd experience something." Since that day, I've had other strange experiences. I started seeing dark shadows out of the corner of my eye, and we'd find items that seemed to disappear from where we left them, only to show up somewhere completely different later. Just too many strange, creepy things. Before moving in with my husband, I worked as a maid for Merry Maids. We had a long list of houses to clean every week, and some I'd only been to once because of unsettling vibes. One house in particular belonged to an elderly man who'd lost his wife several years before. Every time I went to clean, I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me. I asked my cleaning partner if he had pets or something, and she said no. But whenever I vacuumed a room or cleaned the bathroom, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I told my partner, who hadn't experienced anything like it, though she admitted she always got a strange feeling there too. The elderly man was sweet, and I'm sure his wife had been as well. But I always felt as though she didn't approve of my presence, almost like she wanted the house to herself. I've had other experiences at different houses, but those are for another time. Now, I'll share a few strange encounters from my high school years at my parents' house. My parents' home is relatively small and was built in the late 1970s. We were the second or third family to live there, so I never expected anything paranormal. One day after school, I was reading my English homework and was home alone. To my right, in the doorway that connects the kitchen and living room, I suddenly heard a man and woman bickering intensely. The voices were muffled, but it was as if they were standing only 6 feet away. My dog, who'd been lying at my feet, got up and started growling and barking at the area. I checked every room in the house, making sure no TVs or radios were on, but everything was silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard a conversation somehow trapped in time. A few months later, I was home alone again. My dad had just left for work, and I was in my closet looking for a pair of shoes. The closet door is right next to my bedroom door, which was open. Suddenly, I heard the sound of my father's heavy work boots walking down the hall toward my room. The footsteps passed by my door and went into the den, where I heard the door slam shut. He had just left, so I called out, "Dad, did you forget something?" No reply. When he didn't come out after a few minutes, I started to worry since he would have been late for work. I opened the den door, but he wasn't there. His truck was gone, and he had never returned home. The window was closed, so there was no draft that could have caused the door to slam that hard. My first paranormal experience that I can remember happened when I was around 7. I was in the backyard happily playing on the swing set. My siblings were somewhere else, and my mom was in the house. As I swung back and forth, I heard a stern, almost harsh-sounding older woman call my name. I looked up but kept swinging. Then I heard it again, and this time the voice sounded angry. That was enough for me. I jumped off the swing and went inside, asking Mom if she'd called me. She looked at me, confused, and told me everything was fine and to go back out and play. But I wouldn't go back into the backyard, and I wouldn't let my younger siblings go out there either. About an hour later, our neighbor called my parents. He'd seen a copperhead snake slithering near the swing set, and it had settled under the shed, which was right behind where I'd been playing. My dad called an exterminator, and when they checked, they found an entire nest of snake eggs. Mom asked me again why I thought she'd called my name. I told her that I didn't think it was her. The voice had sounded like an older woman, almost like a grandmother. She looked at me and said, "Well, it seems like you have an angel watching over you." After that, I always seemed to have vivid dreams, and I'd hear that woman's voice whenever danger was near. Fast forward about 12 years to when I was 19. I was living in an older house with a roommate. The house belonged to her grandmother, who was in a nursing home with advanced Alzheimer's. I stayed in her grandmother's old room, and from the start, I noticed the room had a very calm, peaceful energy. A month later, my roommate told me that her grandfather had passed away in that room, in fact, in the very bed I was using. It freaked me out a little, but the peacefulness of the room kept me from being afraid. About a month later, I started having strange dreams again. They weren't clear, but they had an intense feeling to them. One night, I went to bed late and fell asleep quickly. I had an incredibly realistic dream. In it, I was fishing with my little sister, even though I never go fishing, and she fell into the water, swallowing a lot of it. I rushed her to the ER, where the doctor warned us to watch for signs of a lung infection and to call 911 if her breathing got worse. Back at home in the dream, my sister started struggling to breathe. That's when I woke up wide awake, which is rare for me. I felt so uneasy that I paged my boyfriend, back in the day of pagers, and thought about calling my family to make sure everything was okay. Then I heard sirens. For a moment, I thought I'd somehow dialed 911 in my sleep. I paged my boyfriend again, worried. The sirens got closer and closer, and then I looked outside to see police cars, fire trucks, and an ambulance filling the street. But to my confusion, they were stopping at my neighbor's house. I watched from my window, and after about an hour, I saw them bring my neighbor out on a stretcher. I worked for the police department at the time, filing 911 reports, so I checked the report later. It said an unknown woman had called 911 at 2:53 a.m., reported that the neighbor needed immediate help, gave his address, and hung up. I spoke with his wife, who had been out at a family member's house that night. She told me she'd received a call saying her husband needed help. He'd had a heart attack and fallen, and couldn't call for himself. After he was discharged from the hospital, I went to visit him, and he thanked me. I was puzzled and asked what he meant. He told me that when he'd fallen, he'd called out for help, and then he saw his old neighbor, my roommate's grandfather, standing there. His old friend assured him he'd be okay and that he'd get help. He said he watched his old friend walk from his house toward my window, and the next thing he knew, the paramedics arrived. To this day, I don't know if I picked up on something that night, or if his spirit knew I was receptive to strange events and would somehow act on the dream. I wondered why the dream was about my sister, who was perfectly fine, unless it was meant to get my attention in the most urgent way possible. Whatever the reason, my neighbor lived many more years and thanked me often for saving his life. Back on October 15, 2004, my girlfriend decided to surprise me with a trip to Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, a week before my birthday. Knowing my fascination with the supernatural, she thought it would be a perfect gift, and I was excited. I even bought a digital voice recorder and got my camera ready. We left that Saturday around noon. Since we live about an hour and a half away, I wanted to make the most of it. When we arrived, we parked in the Forest Preserve lot across the street and walked over to the cemetery gate. There's no parking right by the cemetery, and any attempts to park elsewhere can result in a ticket or even being towed. The walk isn't far, but as we got closer to the gate, I started to feel this strange heaviness in the air. I turned on my recorder, but it began to skip from 17 seconds to 23 seconds, almost like it was glitching. We brushed it off and started taking photos, snapping as many as we could. It was around 42 degrees and started to drizzle, so we hurried, feeling increasingly uneasy as we explored. We kept sensing eyes on us, and I even felt like something was breathing down my neck. After about 20 minutes, Feeling seriously creeped out, we decided to leave. The whole time, we were the only people there. Once we got back to the car, I played back the recording. I nearly had a heart attack. I heard a voice whisper, "Get out," and at one point, when I asked my girlfriend to take a picture of me, we heard another voice, almost mocking, say, "Yes, go ahead, take a picture." But the real strangeness started when we got home. That night, I suddenly came down with a terrible cough and sore throat, even though I'm normally very healthy and rarely get sick. There's no way I could have fallen that ill from just 20 minutes in the cold, especially as warmly dressed as I was. By the next morning, when my girlfriend came over, I had a fever of 101, and I was so sick I could barely move. She brought her laptop, and together we looked through the pictures we'd taken. What we found gave us chills. We'd captured images of a man by a fallen tree, a full-bodied apparition of a woman floating with what looked like flowers in her hands, and lots of faces and white mist in the background. It was as if the spirits had appeared right in front of us, caught on camera. Things only went downhill from there. About a month after our visit to the cemetery, we moved into an apartment together, but our bad luck seemed to follow us. Within 2 months, we were in a car accident. A month after that, she lost her job unexpectedly, followed by me losing mine. Despite countless interviews, we couldn't find work. The entire year was filled with bad luck. We were constantly sick with the flu, and we had non-stop problems with our apartment. Within a year, we lost the place and ended up moving in with my parents. It took months before we finally found work again. Before that visit to Bachelor's Grove, we'd been happy and healthy. But that cemetery seemed to bring a dark energy with it, something that lingered and affected everything. I won't go back there. My friends want to, but I tell them they're crazy. I never believed in curses before, but this changed my mind. Even now, 2 years later, things still haven't fully returned to normal, though they've gotten a bit better. I still have the voice recordings and pictures, and when I listen to the recordings, the strange voices are clear as day. I've tried submitting the photos to ghost sites, but they've never been published like I hoped. To all the ghost hunters out there, my advice is, don't go there. Bachelor's Grove is definitely haunted, but it's better to leave those spirits in peace. They clearly don't want visitors. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. When I was around 7 or 8, my mom's husband bought a house on the outskirts of Muncie, Indiana, near the old Ball family mansion. Built in the early 1900s on what used to be an Indian burial ground, the house was massive and even had a tennis court, a pool with a pool house, and a large yard. It had been vacant for 2 years and was a bit run down, so we got it for a surprisingly low price. The house had quite a history. It was previously owned by an older woman and her husband, and before them, it had belonged to the woman's wealthy family. The actress that the movie Mommy Dearest is based on had even stayed there once. The woman had passed away in the master bedroom, while her husband had died in a plane crash. An old family friend named Jack, who had lived in the servant quarters, which had been converted into apartments, told us that the couple was buried in the woods behind the house, as they had loved it there. Jack also shared that a little boy had drowned in the pool during the 1920s. Even as a young kid, I found the house's history fascinating, until the strange things started happening. One of the first odd experiences happened when my mom and I were sitting in the sunroom. We both noticed a strong, old-fashioned perfume scent, like an older woman's perfume, filling the room. We searched for the source but couldn't figure out where it was coming from. After that, things quieted down for a few weeks until the footsteps started. My bedroom was at the end of a long hallway, and to get there you had to go through another room. My room was the only one in the house with carpet, and I could see straight into the connecting room from my bed. The staircase curved into the hallway, where there were French doors leading to the other part of the hall and, eventually, to my room. At night, I'd often hear heavy footsteps coming up and down the stairs. Then they would move through the hallway, open the doors, and enter the connecting room. One night, the footsteps came into my room, stopping right beside my bed. I could hear faint breathing, just inches away. Sometimes I'd go to my mom, but she'd tell me it was just my imagination. Years later, She admitted that she had heard strange sounds herself. Most of the time, though, I would just hide under the covers and try to keep still. When summer vacation rolled around, my mom would sometimes leave me home alone to run errands. I'd be watching TV in the living room and would often catch glimpses of strange, shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye. But when I'd turn to look, they'd disappear. Once, while home alone, I heard movement upstairs. When I muted the TV, I could hear loud thumping and heavy footsteps moving quickly back and forth between the hallway and the master bedroom. Oddly enough, I never felt terrified, as if the spirits wanted to harm me. I always felt like they were just curious, maybe wondering who was living in their beloved house. Toward the end of our time in the house, shortly before my mom and stepdad divorced, I had some friends over. We ventured down into the basement, which had an old coal burner, a broken safe, a steam room, and the laundry area. My friends and I were curious about the coal burner, so we opened it up and found piles of old newspaper clippings and even some animal bones, which was pretty strange. Another odd thing we experienced was the frequent smell of tobacco smoke, like someone was smoking a large pipe. When we mentioned it to Jack, he told us that the husband who died in the plane crash always had a big pipe in his mouth. Even though I've since moved out, I'll never forget my experiences in that house. I'm just thankful that our ghosts seemed friendly and didn't mean us any harm. I've been sleeping erratically lately. A recent tragedy has made it hard for me to find peace in my dreams, and it feels like I'm ready to cancel my subscription to sleep entirely. I try to drift off with calm intentions, but I usually end up jolting awake, pain searing through my body as I struggle not to cry out and alert my family. I think I've hidden this from them so far, but I'm not sure how long I can keep it up. I've always believed that dreams reveal the soul's inner workings, sometimes even leading to visions. But I'm struggling to understand the latest series of dreams. A few nights ago, I dreamed of an open field, bursting with wildflowers. A gentle breeze blew, the kind that makes you lift your face and close your eyes, just to take it all in. In my dream, I could see myself doing exactly that. I walked down a small slope, then up again to a grand old tree mother willow. I placed my hand on her trunk, taking in the surroundings. In the near distance stood a young man, watching me silently. I raised a hand to acknowledge him, and he gave me a faint smile, nodding slightly before fading away. The next day, I received an email with a photo attachment, and there, smiling at me from the computer screen, was that same young man. A couple of nights later, I found myself in another open field, this time covered with tall grass. There were a few trees and bushes scattered around, but nothing else. I wandered over to a lilac bush and sat down. As I touched its leaves, I looked to my left. Not far from me stood a young woman. I raised my hand to greet her. She smiled, turned, and bent to pick a daisy that hadn't been there a moment before. Then, just like the young man, she faded away. This dream startled me enough that I woke up and decided to check my email. There was another photo waiting, a picture of the young woman I'd just seen. Last night, I dreamed of the ocean. I could feel the salt spray on my face and taste it in the air. I climbed up onto an outcrop of large rocks along the shore and sat down. Scattered on the rocks were a few shells, left behind by the tide. As I sat there examining one, I glanced over to my right, where an old man was standing. In my dream, I remembered that waving made the others fade away. So this time, I simply smiled and invited him to sit beside me. He smiled back and joined me. For a while, we just looked at each other, and then we turned to gaze at the ocean. The water was clear, and I could see all sorts of life moving just beneath the surface. The air above filled with winged creatures, and butterflies landed softly on the rocks around us. Then the man raised his hand, palm up, and gently trailed his fingers through the air, as if conducting an unseen orchestra. I've been struggling lately, questioning certain aspects of my life and why they're happening. In that moment, the answer came to me. Not in words, but in the old man's silent, graceful movements. It was as if he was saying that everything has a purpose, that all things are needed to make life complete. Even the things we might take for granted are essential, even if they aren't ours to keep. One interesting thing, the people I saw in my dreams and later in the photos weren't actually connected to the people who sent me the emails. They were just bystanders captured in the background. I can't help but wonder, is there something I'm meant to do for these people? Something I haven't realized? Or is it all just a series of coincidences? Events connected only by the strange weave of life. As many of you know, I've been experiencing strange occurrences in my house, and I've been trying to understand what's going on. After joining this site and posting about my experiences, I received an email from another member, I'll keep their name private, who reached out to share that she and her son were also dealing with unsettling happenings in their house. She described these occurrences, and many of them were similar to what I was experiencing. She told me that she'd contacted a ghost hunting agency, much like ghost hunters, and they were scheduled to investigate her house. She invited me to join, but unfortunately, I couldn't make it. After that, she never contacted me again and stopped responding to my calls. I figured that either she didn't want to talk about it anymore or things had escalated, and she was too afraid to revisit it. Later, I received another email from a different member who lived in my neighborhood and was also experiencing paranormal activity. To clarify, all of these people live in the same neighborhood as I do. She, too, had called in ghost researchers. If you think my experiences sounded intense, you should have been there for hers. At her house, we heard what sounded like a child running in the attic. But when the ghost hunters placed a recorder in the attic, the noises stopped. While we were there, I personally saw a shadow in her master bedroom that didn't match any of the people present. Two of the ghost hunter girls both heard a whisper in their ear at the same time. It was an incredible night, to say the least. After that investigation, with her schedule and mine, we eventually lost touch. Then, one day, I received yet another email from someone else in the area who was also experiencing paranormal activity. This person reported full-body apparitions, a woman dressed in clothing from the Civil War period. At first, he thought he only had one spirit in his house, but when he consulted a psychic, she revealed there were actually two entities: the Civil War woman he'd seen and a soldier. The psychic even provided names. She explained that the spirits were drawn to his property because he'd recently created a pond in his backyard. Apparently, the pond was built right where there had once been a large plantation house where the woman and the soldier had lived. The soldier, she noted, had one boot that was larger than the other, which caused a distinctive thumping sound whenever he walked. A sound my neighbor had often heard, right before he would drop his boot. At this point, you might be wondering, what is going on in this neighborhood? Several people in this area have reported seeing, hearing, and experiencing paranormal activity. I've tried researching the property's history but always seem to hit dead ends. Our neighborhood is part of a larger community called Heartland Crossing, located in Canby, Indiana, and includes several subdivisions. Whatever is going on here, it seems we're not alone in experiencing it. A few days ago, Thursday the 8th, it's now Monday the 11th, I had a strange encounter with something I can't quite make sense of. I'm hoping someone here might have insights or advice. First, a little about me. For as long as I can remember, I've been sensitive to things beyond the ordinary. Or maybe I'm completely batty. Either way, I've always been aware of things. Seeing, hearing, even occasionally smelling or tasting sensations that seem otherworldly. I don't see these entities clearly. At most, I catch a dense shadow, mist, or silhouette, but I often sense something more, a sort of empathy or awareness, as if there's a presence near me, even if it doesn't have a physical form. The feeling reminds me of sensing another person or animal nearby, but without a body. I'm not quick to label myself a psychic. I might be sensitive or empathic, but I couldn't predict your future or read obscure details about you. I just seem to intuitively know if someone's near, along with things like gender or emotions. So take that as you will. Now let's get to what happened. For a few weeks, here at my grandparents' house in Indianapolis, an old, large house on the southwest side of town, my grandmother and I had been hearing odd noises coming from upstairs at night. The upper rooms have been untouched for at least 15 to 17 years, so hearing creaks, thumps, and heavy footsteps coming from above was more than a little unnerving. Sometimes it sounded like a rolling, almost hoof-like thumping. We usually tried to pass it off as squirrels or raccoons that might have slipped in through the damaged roof. But Just to be sure, my grandfather and I went upstairs on Wednesday during the day to check things out. We found no signs of recent activity. No animal tracks or droppings, no footprints. The floor is carpeted, so footprints would be hard to see, just old, broken cobwebs. Satisfied, we shrugged it off as nothing. The next night, I was up late talking to my girlfriend when the noises started again, louder and more insistent. Annoyed and curious, I decided to grab a flashlight and head up. At the top of the stairs, there are 3 doors, each leading to one of the large upstairs rooms. Left, right, and center. I checked the right room first, as its door tends to come open on its own due to age and warping. I searched thoroughly, opening every drawer, but found nothing. I closed the door and went across to the left room, repeating the process with the same results. When I came out, though, the center door was slightly ajar. I chalked it up to the warping, shrugged it off, and went inside to check. As I turned from the dresser against the far wall, a tendril of pure fear seemed to pierce the air. It was an overwhelming, foreign sensation, almost as if I was feeling someone else's terror. In that moment, all I could think of were those horror movies where the monster is lurking just above on the ceiling. Somehow, I managed not to panic. I swung my flashlight around, scanning the ceiling and walls, but nothing was there, at least until the beam passed over something that moved, quick as a shadow. I swung the light back, trying to catch it again, but it was gone. The fear remained, freezing me in place. Then, a loud, dreadful thump near the door. I pointed my light at the source and felt paralyzed by what I saw. Something was crouched near the floor, staring back at me. I'm still working on a drawing because it's hard to describe. It had multiple limbs arranged in rows, all resembling humanoid arms, mottled and pinkish under the flashlight. Its body was dark and shadowy, almost furry or indistinct, even in the light. A twisted neck extended from its torso, leading to a vaguely humanoid head, pale and with a disturbingly long mouth that stretched almost from the base of the skull to the chin. Lining either side of its face were rows of large, dilated eyes, like it was adapted to see in the dark. Judging by its size, if it had a normal density, it could easily have weighed around 120 pounds. We stared at each other for what felt like at least 10 minutes, each of us gripped by our own fear. Gradually, I steadied myself. The creature hadn't moved, and I didn't sense any hostility. Summoning my courage, I took a small step forward. It responded by backing up, which encouraged me to take another step, cautiously closing the distance. Each time I moved forward, it retreated further, backing toward the large walk-in closet on the right side of the doorway. As it backed up, it reached out, turned the closet knob, opened the door, and skittered inside. The movement produced that familiar rolling thumping sound we'd been hearing. The creature closed the door behind itself. Not knowing what else to do, I bolted downstairs, sat up until morning with all the lights on, and kept a handgun within reach. Since then, we still hear the noises sometimes, though they're quieter now. I've had a few mind and life-altering experiences over the years. For those of you who don't know me, I work in the medical field, though mostly in name. I don't have formal medical training, but I've learned from bits of training, personal research, and from being in the right place at the right time to overhear doctors and nurses while caring for my clients. Most of my clients are elderly, and I've had some powerful spiritual experiences through or with them. The experience I want to share happened with a middle-aged client of mine. We were visiting, just enjoying each other's company, when he suddenly began showing signs of a heart attack. Since he's deaf, he couldn't tell me his symptoms, and both of his hands were immobilized, making it impossible for him to communicate in sign language. I quickly called paramedics, and we headed to the hospital. Regulations prevented me from riding with him in the ambulance, so I followed in my own car with a flashing light on the roof. As we sped down State Road 119 between Napanee and Wakarusa, we approached a busy intersection. The ambulance attendant radioed me a quick warning about a motorcyclist at the intersection who seemed a bit impatient. He had started forward, then stopped, and then started forward again. Just then, I saw him try to ride through the intersection, right between the ambulance and my car. In a desperate attempt to avoid him, I swerved left and braked hard. Unfortunately, there was no avoiding impact. Since I was following an ambulance, help was there immediately. I succumbed to a concussion and passed out beside the young man. When I finally regained consciousness, I learned I'd been drifting in and out for several days. The hospital staff, many of whom I knew by name, treated me as a patient instead of a colleague, even taking contagious disease precautions around me. I found it a bit strange, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to being just another patient to them now. What the staff later filled me in on surprised me. Despite suffering several broken and fractured bones and a concussion severe enough to put me in a coma, I had somehow traveled the 40 feet to where the young man had been thrown in the road. Despite my condition, I was attempting to help him, though my efforts weren't enough to save him. As the EMTs reached us, one of them overheard me say what she thought was, "Accept the white light," as I lightly held the young man's arm. During my stay in the hospital, according to my records, I had experienced what they termed severe hallucinations and malvisions of people in my life who had passed away. I apparently held full conversations with these presences, and the last recorded words I spoke while drifting in and out of consciousness were, "I know I have to rest. I still have work to do." A day later, I regained full consciousness and faced the battery of questions they ask everyone coming out of such a state. I'm still receiving medical care but will soon be released to continue recovering at home. In the meantime, I continue to receive visits from unseen friends and relatives. My son tells me to ask them to wait, as they're keeping me from getting well enough to come home. My roommate tells me she can see shadows of them, though nothing more, which reassures me that this isn't just a hallucination. The hospital staff has been patient, re-explaining the effects of a concussion and urging me to consider various medications. This experience has taught me that we each hold different views of what's really going on in the world around us. We believe we understand what lies in the fabric of the air, but until our beliefs are truly tested, we don't really see what's there in the wrinkles and shadows, the things that have always been there, unnoticed. I only wish I had the means to document even a small part of these experiences. By the way, I know that what I told the young motorcyclist was truly, "Accept the white light," even though I don't consciously remember saying it. A few friends and I decided to head out to an abandoned nursing home for our first Ouija board experience together. I tried it a few times as a kid but never had any interesting results. This time, we made our own board out of plywood, sanding it down and adding personal touches. We chose a room with a broken window for a quick exit, just in case, laid a circle of salt around us and got ready. While the others participated, I documented the questions and answers in a notebook. We began with the usual, "Is anyone here?" Then we asked, "Are you from the sun or the moon? And do you love God?" I had read somewhere that demons can't lie about these questions. Though I'm not sure if it's true, feedback on this would be interesting. Eventually, we made contact with a spirit named Josie, which we figured out was phonetically spelling Josie. Josie said she hadn't lived in the nursing home, but someone she loved had. During the session, the board started to spin and rotate slowly, whenever Josie answered. When we asked where her loved one was now, she directed the planchette to the moon symbol, which we'd read could represent hell. As she gave her answer, the board started twitching, almost vibrating, rotating one way, then the other. We took this as a sign of Josie being upset or sad about discussing something painful. We asked if she wanted to stop, and she said yes. So we ended the session with goodbye and left it at that. A few weeks later, we decided to try another location, this time an abandoned fraternity house that had once been a school for black children just after slavery ended. We picked a room deep inside the house, but, unfortunately, forgot to bring salt this time. Maybe we were feeling a bit overconfident. Once again, we asked, "Is anyone there?" The planchette moved to yes. "Are you from the sun or the moon?" It went to the moon slowly, almost as if it didn't want to admit it. We exchanged uneasy looks, knowing this might not be good. Still, we pressed on and asked one final question. "Do you love God?" The answer was no. That was enough for us. We moved the planchette to goodbye and left the house without looking back. A few days later, we decided to try the board one more time, this time in the basement of one friend's house. We were curious to see what might happen in a more familiar setting, though we once again neglected to make a salt circle. Anyone there? The planchette moved to yes almost immediately. Are you from the sun or the moon? Moon. This answer also came fast. Feeling unsettled, we quickly ended the session. But curiosity got the better of us, so we decided to ask just one more question. We reconnected and asked the same questions. Yes, someone was there, and yes, it was from the moon. Then we asked, were you the one we contacted the other night? The answer came almost instantly. Yes. At this point, we closed the session immediately, moving the planchette to goodbye and leaving the room. I felt strange afterward. Uneasy, a bit queasy, and oddly angry at one of my friends. While I lay down to rest, my friends did some quick online research. They decided to bless some water, broke the board into pieces, 7, I think, and went into the woods to bury each piece in separate spots, sprinkling the graves with the blessed water. After that, I felt an odd sense of relief. Maybe it was just psychological, but the heavy feeling lifted. Nothing strange happened after that, though we couldn't shake the idea that an entity might have followed us or attached itself to the board. One friend had an unfortunate incident a few days after our last session, and we still wonder if it was all connected. When I was about 8 years old, my family decided to spend a 2-week vacation searching for the lost graves of our ancestors. These are graves documented as being in one town but are actually somewhere else entirely. My father, who has been into genealogy for as long as I can remember, was determined to track down these misplaced markers. I sometimes wonder if discovering that one of his relatives was a real pirate might have fueled his enthusiasm. After all, not all ancestors wear the white hat. Our family of 4 traveled to Eagle Harbor, Michigan, staying at a hotel run by the Jennison family, right on the lake. My parents had honeymooned there, and it seemed fitting for our trip. Down the road was an old, eerie cemetery that I immediately wanted to explore. The hotel loaned bikes to guests, and since my dad wasn't planning to go until the next day, I thought I'd get a head start. How great would it be if I could help him find something significant? The cemetery's fence was tipped over, like an old sentry who'd grown too tired to stand. The gate hung on by a single hinge, ready to give way at any moment. I knew the cemetery was as old as the town itself, with over 200 years of history etched into stone. One warning kept running through my mind, to watch out for sunken graves and steer clear of them. I wasn't sure if it was my dad's advice or something else, but it felt more like a whisper than a memory. As I wandered, I heard a male voice and, naturally, went toward the sound, hoping to find a caretaker who could tell me more about the cemetery's history. This was my first time really exploring a cemetery on my own, and I figured an expert could offer some tips beyond my dad's knowledge. Toward the back of the cemetery, there was a section surrounded by a fence made of chicken wire, enclosing 20 to 30 plain white wooden crosses. There was no gate, just a hook where the fence ended so you could unfasten it, walk in, and rehook it behind you. Inside, there was an eerie silence. No rustling leaves, no birds, no crickets. The only sound was the voice of the man, though I couldn't hear anyone responding to him. I looked around, puzzled. None of the crosses had names, dates, or messages for loved ones, just bare markers. I spotted the man then, sitting by a fresh grave, holding a bunch of daisies and talking as if sharing everyday thoughts with someone. Assuming he'd recently lost a loved one, I didn't want to intrude, so I moved back toward the crosses. As I was leaving that enclosed area, I noticed a sign I hadn't seen before. It read simply, "Colored." The word stopped me cold. I knew about racial segregation from stories and even remembered being locked in a basement during the Detroit riots. But seeing it here, even in a cemetery, hit me hard. How could it be that in death, as in life, people were still separated? Angered, I decided to talk to the man at the grave. When I mentioned it, he responded, "We may be equal in God's eyes, but man still has trouble seeing it that way." We talked for a while and then I turned to leave. Halfway back, I realized I hadn't asked his name and decided to return. But when I reached the spot again, I found no fresh grave, no wooden crosses, just rotting boards poking up through the overgrown vines, brush, and blueberry plants. The graves looked like they hadn't been touched in years, and under the dead leaves, I found rusty chicken wire half buried in the ground. Panic set in and I ran. I tripped over a marker, bounced off another, fell, and finally leaped over the outer fence, jumped on my bike, and pedaled back to the hotel as fast as I could, feeling like something was chasing me the whole way. Once I'd calmed down, I told my dad what had happened. He decided to take me back, not because he believed me but because he wanted to prove that my imagination was running wild. He explained that the cemetery was inactive and that there were no rows of crosses there. He'd researched it all the night before. Sure enough, as we walked through the cemetery, everything was exactly as he described. No new graves, no white crosses, just rows of weathered stones and overgrown plots. The only sign of anything recent was a set of skid marks in the leaves, marking where I'd stumbled and fallen. That, and the grave markers I'd uncovered while tripping. A grave that, it turns out, belonged to my father's great-great-great-aunt and her baby, who we'd been searching for and who was supposed to be buried across the bay in Eagle River. For years, I tried to find more information, hoping to explain what I'd seen that day in the sun-drenched cemetery. All I discovered was a record of a man named Tom Brown, whose grave marker reads simply, Tom Brown/colored/died 05. The date might be wrong, as records suggest he was a sailor who died on a voyage to Michigan and was laid to rest there. I'm left wondering what happened that day. Did I slip into a dream, or did I somehow glimpse a moment from the past? I first started to feel things in my preteens, becoming the unofficial ghost hunter of the family and often the butt of jokes. To avoid the ridicule at family gatherings, I eventually smothered this talent and, over time, forgot most of those experiences. A few moments stuck with me, but I became what they'd consider a normal teen. Now, my teenage daughter has developed a strange magnetism for these experiences, which concerns me, especially since we also have a 4-year-old son who speaks with an eerie certainty about things that happened before, almost as if he's recalling memories from another life. In his own 4-year-old way, he even gives time frames and sometimes warns us about things to come. Either he's highly intuitive, or he's one of the world's most convincing child storytellers. 9 years ago, when our daughter was 6, we lived in a mobile home park in Goshen, Indiana. The houses were close together, so we dismissed many sounds as coming from the neighbors. But often, in the middle of the night, we'd hear the sound of footsteps running down the hall toward our bedroom. In the master bath, I'd have to cover the mirrors above the sinks and even the glass in the door so my daughter would feel comfortable enough to take a bath. She refused to enter if the double glass doors, pretty heavy for a mobile home, were left open. Her bedroom faced the street, and even though the neighborhood was safe, she insisted on covering her window. She had a walk-in closet with sliding doors that would occasionally lift off the track in the middle of the night. Her bathroom shared a wall with her room and was decorated like a little girl's dream bath. Yet she wouldn't enter it alone. We initially thought her reluctance might be because the bathroom door faced the front door of the home, which sometimes caused awkward collisions if both doors were open simultaneously. Eventually, she stopped sleeping in her room altogether. She couldn't explain why. It was just a dark, cold room that made her feel sad. When friends visited, they wouldn't stay in her room long. They'd only go in to pick out toys before retreating to the living room to play. With a new baby on the way and seeing our daughter's discomfort, my husband decided it was time to move. About a week before we moved into a 3-story house in another town, we were lying on our bed, reassuring her about the upcoming changes. A new school, new friends, new neighbors. As we talked, the ceiling fan slowly began to spin. Both the wall switch and pull cord were off, and there was no breeze. The 3 of us were alone in the room, yet the fan moved on its own. In Elkhart, where we moved, things went smoothly for a while. Our daughter adjusted well to her new school and friends. Our bedrooms were all upstairs, ours at the top of the hall, our daughter's across from us, and our son's room at the end of the hall. One night, our daughter woke us up, saying she heard what sounded like gunshots or a car backfiring in her closet. She had a large walk-in closet, 15 by 80 feet, that previous tenants had used for attic space. As we'd moved in during ongoing renovations, we figured the sounds were echoes from the road bouncing around the empty closet. But her room was always cold. We tried space heaters, electric blankets, hall heaters, and kept the thermostat high during the day, but nothing helped. The furnace was serviced, and we left all the doors open to improve airflow, yet her room remained cold. My son's room shared a wall with her closet, and strangely, his door began to shut itself. It felt as if someone was slowly closing it, almost like a child sent to their room, watching and waiting for someone to come. Our daughter soon befriended someone we never saw. She'd sit in the closet for hours, talking and playing, the heavy metal accordion-style doors wide open. In my son's room, his musical toys would start playing on their own, but CDs and tapes wouldn't work there, only the radio. Whenever we moved the player to another room, it worked fine. Soon, our daughter began experiencing recurring stomach issues, and behavioral problems at school started creeping in. One morning, she was going downstairs for school when she fell down 10 steps. She picked herself up at the landing, then fell down the remaining 4 steps. She told us she felt dizzy and just lost her balance. Twice. Later, my husband, a 5 feet 11 inches, 270-pound wrestler build, was shoved up the stairs and once had his ankle grabbed as he ran up, leaving a handprint. He was found lying on the carpet as if asleep. Friends who stayed in the basement bedroom, right below our daughter's room and bathroom, reported feeling their toes touched, hearing breathing sounds, and once even feeling someone sit beside them on the bed. A friend who stayed in our daughter's room fell violently ill, unable to move, until we moved her to a different room, where her symptoms vanished instantly. One day, as I got ready for work, I spoke briefly with my daughter before she left for school. Moments later, I felt dizzy, blacked out, and woke up to my son crying, with my husband on the phone explaining that they'd found me on the floor. There was no medical reason for me to pass out. I eventually sought help from a coworker whose husband was a healer. She and 2 associates helped us perform a house blessing with our daughter present, but it only seemed to make her uneasy. Shortly after, I was told to watch for signs of possession, not in the house itself, but in my daughter. So we enrolled her in outpatient therapy with a psychologist known for dealing with paranormal issues, hoping it might help. Instead, the activity intensified, and after 3 years with little guidance, we stopped the sessions. 2 years ago, we moved about 4 miles away, unrelated to the disturbances. Now we're experiencing similar events in our new home. An insurance agent once asked who lived in the attic. No one. It's unfinished and doesn't even have a full floor. This door, secured with a hook lock, opens on its own. A friend visited with her 1-year-old, who played happily at a small desk by the attic door but soon got sick. Outside, she was fine, but each time she returned to the desk, she'd get ill again with no clear cause. We also get calls at all hours with no one on the line. A bedroom door opens on its own. Music plays in one corner of the living room with no source, and items we put away appear in strange places. My daughter, now 15, experiences these things alongside us, but I fear she might be drawing them in somehow. If she has a unique energy, how can I help her manage it? If it's a spirit following us, what can I do to help it find peace? And if we move again, how do I ensure these disturbances don't follow us? I grew up in a house that was over 100 years old. It had been built from an older barn, so it was likely even older than that. When I was younger, babysitters would often tell me that our house felt creepy, and that they'd heard strange noises when my parents were out. I shrugged it off, figuring that doors opening by themselves and unexplained noises were just quirks of an old house. But as I got older, my perspective started to change. One morning, when I was around 16 or 17, I was sitting on my bed, looking out the windows, when I caught a glimpse of a woman standing beside me out of the corner of my eye. She wore a long dark dress with poofy sleeves, and her hair was pulled back in a bun. When I turned to look, she vanished. Another time, I felt a whisper in my ear. A woman's voice saying my name. Thinking it was my mom, I turned, but no one was there. I'd also hear footsteps come down the hall, stop right beside me, and once, the faint sound of women laughing downstairs. Each time I was completely alone. I mentioned it to my mom, half laughing, but my mom surprised me by saying she believed me and thought I was lucky to experience something so special. Over time, I grew accustomed to the lady and even started talking to her when I was alone. It made me feel a bit silly, but she had a comforting presence, almost motherly. I started to think of her as someone who watched over us. Once, when I lost a soccer ball, I searched my room 3 times without success. Out of frustration, I finally whispered, "Lady, could you help me find my ball?" Chuckling at myself, I turned back to my room, and there it was, sitting in the middle of my bed. Couldn't believe it. Every so often, I'd see her peeking into my room, as if just checking in. I never told my sister about the lady, not wanting to scare her. She was 12 at the time, and I assumed she'd think it was too spooky. But as it turned out, she'd met the lady too and didn't share my comfort with her presence. One night, my girlfriend and a few friends were over, and we were watching a movie called The House. It was a cheesy ghost movie about a guy who inherits his grandmother's haunted house. There's a scene where the grandmother, dressed in a long black dress with her hair in a bun, warns him to leave, then disappears. My sister instantly burst into tears, crying, "The lady! The lady!" At that moment, I realized she must have seen the lady too. This revelation shook me. My sister's reaction made it impossible to write off my experiences as imagination. Later, I gently asked her what she'd seen. She told me she'd seen a woman in a long black dress cross her room and disappear, even hearing the sound of her dress brushing the floor. It was a surreal moment for both of us. I'd thought all this time that I was the only one seeing her, but now I knew I wasn't alone. Some of my friends became intrigued and wanted to try to see or hear the lady. They'd come over when my parents were out, and we'd sit in my room waiting quietly. Nothing ever happened that we couldn't easily explain. One night, though, we made a makeshift Ouija board out of an old mirror I'd found in the basement. Using pieces of paper and a shot glass as a planchette, we started asking questions, and to my surprise, the glass began moving, answering us. The lady's name came through as A.J., and we learned she had supposedly died of pneumonia in the 1800s. I can't remember all the details and wish I'd written them down. Still, in the back of my mind, I wondered if one of my friends was just pushing the glass. I didn't want to believe it. I always felt the lady would never harm us in any way. After I graduated from high school, I moved out. I felt a deep sadness and guilt, as if I were abandoning not only my family but the lady too. She had become such a quiet presence in my life. I never felt her again after I left, and I imagine she's still there, in that old house. My parents divorced and eventually sold the house. Now, whenever I come back to town, I drive by to see it. It sat vacant for a long time. I'll sometimes look in through the front room windows and remember Christmases and birthdays spent there. Occasionally, I swear I can feel her watching from the other side of the glass. Someone she can guide by leaving little hints, just like she did for me. My story is one I hardly know how to tell. It's a true twist of fate. To start from the beginning would take some time, and though it sounds strange, it's all true. This isn't a made-up tale. All the facts can be proven. I grew up in North Terre Haute, and as a young man, I'd often go to a local store, Stapleton's, which was known for serving lunch to school kids. It was a small place, tucked behind a gas station and across from a local tavern called Jig's. The owner, Mr. Stapleton, was an intimidating man with a hardened face and a no-nonsense attitude. I always felt a strange vibe around him. Nothing threatening, but something that stirred my gut. He and his wife lived nearby, in one of the nicest homes in the area. As kids, we'd ride our bikes to that gas station and sometimes stop to stare at his house, wondering about the people inside. But I never saw anyone around, only the dim glow of lights at night. Years passed, and by the time I was in high school, Mr. Stapleton was still a familiar face. Then, on Thanksgiving morning in 1978 or 79, I watched him die. My father and I were heading to the IGA for my mom and were among the first on the scene of a terrible accident. A classmate of mine, who I later worked with, had been driving a Buick Wildcat and attempted to pass a car in the wrong lane. He hit Mr. Stapleton's car as it was pulling out onto Highway 41, killing him instantly. Witnesses said my classmate had dropped the car into low and accelerated just before impact. Over time, I watched Mr. Stapleton's once beautiful house fall into disrepair, eventually fading from my memory. I married, and shortly after the birth of my second child, I bought a home near my parents' place and remodeled it. One day, while driving by the old Stapleton house, I saw they were preparing for an estate sale. Curious, I went with my youngest daughter, hoping to buy a rocking chair that was listed. The home had an undeniable charm. It was well built, even after years of neglect, and walking through the rooms, I felt an odd sense of connection. Something about the house tugged at me, though a strange, sick feeling crept up at times. Despite this, I was drawn to it, and with little more than a 20% down payment, I bought the house. My wife and I were both shocked. I had no idea how much this house would end up changing our lives. The renovation process was intense. I worked late into the night, sometimes staying there alone, sleeping a few hours and getting back to work. My father would help when he could. One night, while working in the basement, we heard the back door open, followed by footsteps walking across the floor above us. I called out, but there was no response. I went up a ladder to check, no one was there. We laughed it off, chalking it up to old house noises. But soon, strange things began to escalate. One night, while working, I noticed moving cold spots. Chills so deep you'd feel them in your bones. I tried to dismiss them as drafts. On a hot summer evening, my German shepherd, Sam, who was usually calm, began acting skittish. She'd bark and growl, something I couldn't see. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from the master bedroom. I went to check and found the bathroom door had slammed shut, with Sam barking at it. I brushed it off as more drafty old house problems. Yet I couldn't shake the growing feeling that something else was going on. Then came more incidents. The master bath door would slam randomly and get jammed, no matter how many times I trimmed it. I finished the renovations and moved my family in, trying to settle into our new space. But that's when we all began experiencing unsettling events. One morning, my wife woke me, frustrated, saying all the kitchen cabinet doors were open. This happened repeatedly over the next few months, and each time I brushed it off as my own prank, hoping to avoid scaring my wife and kids. Eventually, it became a running joke. We'd hear the back door open, footsteps walk across the floor, and of course, no one would be there. Then, one night, I was awakened by creaking sounds in the hallway. I heard footsteps approaching my youngest daughter's room, and the sound of someone twisting her door knob. I assumed it was my oldest daughter, who often walked around at night in complete darkness. But when I checked, both girls were sound asleep. The next morning, my youngest daughter told me to stop twisting her doorknob in the night. I laughed it off as my own doing, trying to keep the peace. Sam started barking aggressively from the garage under our bedroom. Every time she barked, we'd find the basement window wide open, even after bending the latch to keep it shut. This continued until one January evening, after a day in the country with my family. We arrived home, and as I let Sam out, she acted oddly clingy, staying close to me. I left her by the garage door and looked back just in time to see her collapse. Sam had died on the spot. When I went to check the basement window, I found scratch marks and chew marks where she'd clawed at something unseen. That feeling came back, stronger than ever, and my blood ran cold. After Sam's death, things quieted down until one March evening. My wife and I were arguing, trying to work on our troubled marriage, and we were getting ready to go to Saturday evening mass with the kids. As we were leaving, I tried to open the laundry room door, but it wouldn't budge. Something was pushing back on the door, resisting me. When it finally slammed shut on me, I burst through, only to find the room empty. My wife and kids saw everything. That night felt like the breaking point. Shortly after, my wife and I separated and I moved out. Later, my youngest daughter moved to the basement with a friend. She told us that clocks wouldn't keep time and that the TV would turn on by itself. Once, she and her friend watched a lamp fly across the room, hitting the wall above their bed. They moved out of the basement that night. The whole experience left a mark on me that I'll carry forever. I still dream about that house, and there's something I can't put my finger on that feels unfinished. It sold quickly after my divorce, and I often wonder if the new occupants have had any strange experiences. The house is located at 3365 Crystal Avenue, North Terre Haute, Indiana. Part of me wants to go back and talk to the current residents, but I'm afraid of reopening something I can't finish now that I don't live there. I saw glimpses of figures and shadows, always from the corner of my eye, but the feeling was unmistakable, the presence of a ghost. My mother endured years of abuse at the hands of my stepfather, Richard. Her life had always been difficult. She was born in 1931 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and worked picking cotton from a young age. At just 18, she was pregnant and engaged to a man named Burl Raines, but my grandfather Clarence didn't approve. My grandmother Evelyn favored her sons and insisted my mother leave the house once she turned 18. With only a grade school education, my mother was left to face deep poverty on her own. In what my grandmother thought was an act of mercy, she took my mother's newborn daughter, Connie, and gave her to her own uncle in what was essentially an illegal adoption. Connie was taken from my mother's arms, never to be seen again. I'll never forget how my mother cried telling me that story in 1980. With no support from her family, my mother moved to Chicago, where she became a dancer in the nightclubs. She grew famous, performing all over the United States, and eventually had me. For a brief time, she left me in the care of an Indian dancer while she worked in Duluth, Minnesota. In Duluth, my mother met a man named Richard at a motel, and soon she fell in love with him. She returned to Chicago to get me, and we both went back to Duluth to be with him. Richard had a violent side, which became painfully clear one day when my mother made the mistake of putting her cigarette out in an ashtray in Richard's brother Dennis's room. Richard found the cigarette, saw the lipstick on it, and lost control, nearly strangling Dennis with a telephone cord. Despite this, my mother stayed with him, eventually moving out of his mother's house and marrying him. Richard moved us to Chicago, where he worked as an engineer, but his violent streak only grew worse. I watched him abuse my mother and us kids, and that trauma stayed with us. In 2000, my mother ended up in the hospital. A nurse showed me where small strokes had damaged her legs and head, likely from Richard's years of beating her. Seeing this made me realize how much she had suffered because of him. Richard passed away in July 2000 on a blisteringly hot day. When my mom found out, she panicked and kept asking, "Where is Dickie?" I reminded her that he was gone, but she couldn't process it. My sister Gina inherited Richard's life insurance and took over all arrangements, putting my mom in a nursing home against her wishes. My mother had always told me she didn't want to go to a nursing home, but Gina wouldn't let me take her. Mom ended up 75 miles away in Chicago, and my van wasn't reliable enough to make the trip due to a radiator leak. Only a few weeks later, I got the call that my mother had passed away from a heart attack. Gina arranged the funeral in Woodstock so I could attend, but the atmosphere was tense and full of bitterness. My children and I left as soon as we could. A month later, in the dead of winter, I was driving along Highway 2 in Rockford when I spotted a woman walking in the dark. She had long gray hair flowing in the bitter cold, and she wore a long dark dress. She looked exactly like my mother. I watched in disbelief as her figure eventually faded into the darkness as I drove away. A few months after that, my daughter Christina had her own encounter. She saw a ghost under her bed wearing a red witch's hat, with long dark brown hair, pale skin, and an old-fashioned black dress. The ghost just stared at her in silence. When I showed Christina some old photos, she pointed to one of my mother, saying that was who she had seen under her bed. I still wonder if my mother is haunting us. She doesn't have a headstone on her grave because we couldn't afford one, and sometimes I wonder if that's why her spirit hasn't found peace. I know kids have active imaginations, but my best friend's little sister, Brianna, is only 2. She's a smart kid, but what we've seen her experience seems beyond anything a 2-year-old could just make up. The first time we started suspecting Brianna might be seeing ghosts was when we were at Stephanie's old house, helping her pack for a move. Her parents and some other visitors had mentioned seeing ghosts or orbs in that house, but Brianna's experiences were on another level, far more detailed and vivid. Stephanie and I were sitting in the living room watching cartoons when suddenly, Brianna started screaming, "Ow!" from the playroom. We rushed to her, worried she'd hurt herself, but when we got there, she told us she wasn't the one in pain. Confused, since there was no one else in the house, we asked her who was hurting. With her hand over her heart, she simply said, "Grandma." Now, it's not unusual for a little girl to worry about her grandmother, but it turned out that her grandmother had died of a heart attack that very morning. No one, not even her parents, had known about it until later that day. At the time, I was a skeptic, so I tried to find any logical explanation for Brianna's reaction, but I came up empty. A few weeks later, after Stephanie's family had moved into their new house, Brianna claimed to be seeing ghosts again. This time, she came rushing into the living room, crying. We thought she was hurt and started asking what was wrong. At that age, she still mixed up some colors, and she used green instead of white. When we asked what was wrong, she told us she'd seen a man with green ears and messed up teeth. She said he told her he knew her mom and wanted to be wherever she was. That seemed like a typical worry a child might have, just like her worry for her grandmother. But what scared me was when she said, "He wants me to go with him," as she reached out her arms, almost like she was taking someone else's hand. Her last sighting was of what she described as a little boy in strange clothing. For Brianna, strange would mean anything old-fashioned or different from her time. She was sitting on her bed, staring into the closet. Stephanie and I noticed and asked her why she wasn't playing or watching cartoons. Brianna replied that a little boy was lost and couldn't find his mommy. Then she turned to Stephanie and asked, "Stephanie, is it okay to share our mommy with him? He wants one too." Stephanie and I were stunned by this, and it was then I realized it wasn't just Brianna's imagination. Brianna continued to have other strange experiences. One summer night, I was staying over at Stephanie's, as I often did, when we woke up to her mom, Tiffany, crying. We asked what was wrong, and she explained that Brianna had woken up earlier from a nightmare and then sat bolt upright in bed, laughing in a voice that wasn't her own. Still visibly shaken, Tiffany cried even harder as she told us, "That just wasn't my little girl. I could see it all in her eyes." From that point on, Stephanie and I were true believers in the paranormal. We're both incredibly curious about why her 2-year-old sister could see these things so vividly when no one else could. Since the incident with the Ouija board, a lot of strange things happened. The night after our first session, we decided to bring Chelsea's mom, Vicky, upstairs to try it with us. We warmed up by using dowsing rods first, and something odd happened. The rods worked well when I used them, slower with Chelsea, but when Vicky asked questions, they pointed in opposite directions. We couldn't get any clear responses, especially when we asked about the spirit around her. Eventually, we gave up on the rods and set up the Ouija board. Being Christian, I prayed over the board and blessed everything, but looking back, I realize I should have prayed over Chelsea and Vicky too, given what happened next. Our session started off normal, though the atmosphere felt heavier than the night before. We were trying to contact a spirit for Vicky, but we didn't have a specific spirit in mind, just any angel that might be around her. This turned out to be a mistake. When we asked for a name, the board spelled Emma. We then asked for a last name. The pointer moved to yes, but seemed to hesitate, landing on X before sliding to no. Then it shot to the edge of the board, moving off entirely and starting to slide across the floor. Unsure of what to do, we picked up the pointer and placed it back in the center before saying goodbye. Next, we tried to call upon Gabriel, a kinder spirit we'd spoken to before, but something felt off. On previous nights, the planchette had moved smoothly to each letter, stopping perfectly on each one. This time, it was jerky and imprecise, often landing on the edge of letters, making responses hard to read. The atmosphere grew tense and unsettling. We started feeling sick and anxious. Chelsea eventually got too scared to continue and stopped participating. So we ended the session, saying goodbye. The planchette moved there on its own and we stopped. I picked up the dowsing rods again, hoping to understand what had happened. But the rods acted strangely, with one moving rapidly and the other following more slowly. Felt like something was controlling them. Vicky asked, "Are you from hell?" And both rods pointed to yes. She demanded, "Get out. Leave me alone." But the rods pointed to no. I dropped them, feeling unnerved. We were all shaken by then and decided to break the Ouija board. We shattered the planchette and tore the board to pieces. Afterwards, things only got stranger. Vicky didn't notice much of a change. maybe because the spirit had been around her all along. But Chelsea couldn't sleep in her room for 4 months. She felt an evil presence there and spent most nights sleeping on the living room couch. For me, things took a chilling turn. Back home in Texas, I began seeing a ghostly white figure walking down the hall at night. My room has a full view of 2 hallways, so I'd often catch glimpses of her from my bed. One night, my mom called out to me, confirming what I'd seen. "Robbie, can you shut my door? I keep seeing this lady walking around in the hall." That really scared me. Then, on Halloween night around midnight, I had just finished trick-or-treating with friends when my stepsister Chelsea called with some research she'd done. I couldn't find anything on Yixley or Okakurix, but I found something interesting. There's a demon named Zaffin. It's spelled a lot like Zaffer and sounds like it too. I think you might be haunted by a demon. Right after I hung up, I turned around and saw a huge black-cloaked figure standing in my room. It was way too tall to be either my mom or stepdad. It stood there for a few seconds, then left. I told it to go away and leave me alone. In 5 separate incidents after that, I saw the figure again, but then it disappeared for good in mid-December 2008. After that, Chelsea was finally able to sleep in her room peacefully. The white lady stopped walking the halls, and everything returned to normal. The only difference I noticed was that the dowsing rods no longer worked as quickly for me, which was a bit of a letdown.